Detective Clara Hayes gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath fogging the car window as she ascended toward the small town nestled in the folds of the rugged peaks. She had never been to a place quite like this, remote, isolated, and wrapped in a silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. Ahead, the cluster of buildings emerged from the mist, their outlines blurred by the creeping dusk. The town looked as if it had been frozen in time, its weathered facades and narrow streets bearing the weight of countless winters. Clara's eyes flicked to the dashboard where her phone buzzed silently, a message from the police department confirming the details. Mayor Elias Marrow had vanished without a trace 2 days prior. No ransom, no threats, no clues. Just a hollow absence that had left the town on edge. She parked in front of the town's only inn, the Maplewood, its faded sign creaking softly in the cold breeze. Inside, the warm glow of low lamps revealed a handful of patrons clustered in whispered conversation. Clara's boots echoed on the creaking wooden floor as she approached the counter, where a woman with weathered features and keen eyes looked up. This was Maggie Thornton, the innkeeper and the town's informal historian. "You must be Detective Hayes," Maggie said, her voice low but not unkind. "We've been expecting someone." Clara nodded, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I'm here to find out what happened to Mayor Marrow." Maggie's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Well, you've come to a town full of secrets, Detective. Be careful which ones you stir." Before Clara could respond, the door to the sheriff's office down the street opened, and a stocky man in a weather-beaten uniform stepped out. Deputy Sam Collins offered a handshake that was firm but hesitant. "Welcome to Hollow Ridge," he said, his voice edged with a mixture of professionalism and something darker, perhaps conflict. "We're glad you're here, but I won't lie, this place doesn't take kindly to outsiders poking around." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm here to get to the truth, Deputy Collins. Whatever it takes." As night descended, Clara walked the silent streets alone. The windows of the small houses were shuttered tight. Any light inside was dim and flickering. Whispers trailed off as she passed, and the weight of unspoken fears pressed down on her like the dense mountain air. Each face she saw, each guarded glance, hinted at something buried deep beneath the surface. The mayor's disappearance was more than a missing person case, it was a rupture in the fragile fabric that had held this town together. Somewhere in the shadows of these mountains lay the hollow promise that everyone here had made, a secret pact binding them in silence and fear. Clara's fingers tightened around the notebook in her pocket. She would need every ounce of her sharp intuition and persistence to unravel the layers of deception waiting for her in Hollow Ridge. And she already sensed that the truth would come at a high cost. As the clock struck midnight, Clara stood on a ridge overlooking the town. The stars were distant and cold above, and below, the town lay quiet, but not peaceful. Somewhere in that silence was the answer she sought and the danger that came with it. She turned back toward the inn, ready to begin the long, winding path toward the truth. The fading daylight cast long shadows that seemed to cling to the weather-beaten buildings, the scent of pine and wood smoke weaving through the cool breeze. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel, each step echoing a mixture of anticipation and wariness. She had arrived only hours ago, but already the weight of the place pressed on her, a feeling not just of isolation, but of something concealed beneath the surface. Her first stop was the town's inn, a modest but sturdy building that served as the unofficial hub of local news and gossip. Inside, the air was thick with the warmth of a crackling fire and the faint aroma of strong tea and aged wood. The room was sparsely furnished yet welcoming, its walls lined with faded photographs and relics from decades past. Behind the counter stood Maggie Thornton, the innkeeper, her keen eyes briefly flickering with recognition as Clara entered. Maggie was a woman shaped by the mountain town itself, weathered features etched by years of hard living, yet eyes sharp and alert, reflecting a depth of knowledge few outsiders could comprehend. As Clara approached, Maggie offered a nod, moving efficiently to pour a cup of dark, bitter tea. The clink of the porcelain was the only sound in the brief silence that followed. "Detective Hayes," Maggie said, her voice steady but cautious. "I've heard you're asking questions about Elias." Clara accepted the tea with a nod, studying the woman in front of her. "Yes, His disappearance has left the town unsettled. I need to understand what's been going on here, especially the nature of the agreements he made with the residents. Maggie's eyes flicked toward the faded photograph hanging above the fireplace, a portrait of Mayor Elias Marrow, tall and lean, his calm but commanding presence immortalized in black and white. That man, Maggie murmured. He wasn't just a mayor. He was the town's anchor and its secret. Clara leaned forward, sensing the gravity behind those words. What kind of secret? Maggie hesitated, her gaze drifting to the fire's flickering flames. Decades ago, when the town was little more than scattered cabins and stubborn souls trying to carve a life from the mountain, Elias made a promise. Not just a promise, a pact. Every family, every individual, it bound us all. But it wasn't just words on paper. It was something more. A hollow promise, some say, but one that kept the town safe. Clara's brow furrowed. Safe from what? From outsiders, Maggie replied quietly. From change. From the dangers of the world beyond these peaks. But that safety came with a price. Secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Debts that had to be paid in silence. The detective took a slow sip of her tea, the bitter warmth grounding her as the weight of the revelation settled. This wasn't just a missing mayor. It was a town held captive by its own history, its own fears. As the night deepened, Maggie shared fragments of stories, whispers of old grievances, silent betrayals, and a community bound by the unbreakable chains of that secret pact. Clara listened intently, her notebook filling with details that hinted at the complexity beneath the town's placid exterior. When she finally stepped back into the chill of the mountain evening, the stars began to prick the darkening sky. The quiet town seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of the past murmuring in the wind. Clara felt a stirring resolve within her. To uncover the truth behind the hollow promise, she would have to navigate a labyrinth of silence and shadows. Her investigation had only just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, but Clara was determined to follow it no matter where it led. The walls, paneled in dark, varnished wood, absorbed the low murmur of voices and the distant echo of boots on wooden floors. Across the desk sat Deputy Sam Collins, his broad shoulders slumped slightly beneath the weight of the weathered uniform he wore like armor. His eyes, sharp but tired, flickered with the hesitation Clara hadn't yet seen in the others. "Thanks for meeting me, Sam," Clara began, keeping her tone steady though her mind raced. "I'm trying to get a clear picture of what's going on here. The mayor's disappearance isn't just a missing person case. There's something beneath it all." Sam shifted, the chair creaking under his movement. "Detective, this town, it's complicated. We've all got our reasons for keeping certain things quiet." Clara nodded slowly, sensing the unspoken weight pressing down on the man before her. "I need your help, not just as a deputy, but as someone who knows this town inside out." For a long moment, Sam's gaze fell to the scratched surface of the desk. Outside, the mountain wind rattled the old building, a cold reminder of the isolation surrounding them. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally, voice rough. "There are people here who protect their own, and not all of them play by the rules." She leaned forward, curiosity sharpening her features. "Who?" He shook his head, frustration flickering across his face like a storm cloud. "The elders. The mayor's closest allies. They built this town on promises, and some of those promises are better left buried." Clara's mind raced. The secret agreements she'd heard whispers about suddenly took on a darker significance. She thought of the fractured relationships, the silences that stretched between conversations like chasms. "And you, where do you stand in all this?" Sam's jaw tightened. "I'm stuck in the middle. I want to do my job, but I'm loyal to this town. Sometimes those two don't line up." The honesty in his voice was a crack in the town's facade. Clara knew she had to tread carefully. Pushing too hard risked losing a vital ally. "Help me understand. If the mayor's disappearance unravels everything, what happens to this place?" "Chaos," Sam said simply. "And maybe that's what some want." Their talk stretched into the fading afternoon light. Clara made notes, every detail a piece of the puzzle. As the shadows lengthened, she and Sam stepped outside. The mountain air was sharp, crisp against her skin, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The deserted main street lay quiet, the wooden storefronts standing like sentinels guarding secrets. "You believe the mayor's disappearance is more than a simple vanishing?" Clara asked, eyes scanning the silent town. Sam exhaled slowly, the breath misting in the cold air. "I know it is. And I'm scared of what we'll find once the truth comes out." As they walked back toward the station, the distant howl of the wind seemed to echo those fears. Clara's resolve hardened. She would have to navigate these shadows of loyalty carefully if she hoped to unravel the mystery. That evening, in the dim glow of Sam's cluttered living room, the deputy's defenses finally cracked. Photographs of the mayor, old newspaper clippings, and faded letters were scattered across the table. Sam's voice lowered, worn with regret. "He wasn't a perfect man," Sam admitted, eyes distant. "But he kept us safe, or at least, that's what we told ourselves. Those promises he made, they weren't just words, they were chains." Clara listened, absorbing the weight of his confession. The mayor's control wasn't just political, it was personal, binding the town in silence and fear. Sam looked at her then, searching for understanding. "You're poking a hornet's nest, Clara. Are you ready for what might come?" Before she could answer, a sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile calm. Both turned, startled. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Clara's heart quickened. The game had changed, and the watchers were making themselves known. "Who's there?" Clara called, voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. No reply came, just the echo of footsteps fading into the night. Clara exchanged a look with Sam. The stakes had just been raised. The shadows of loyalty were growing darker, and the path ahead more dangerous than ever. As she sat back down, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the town's secrets were closing in, and with them, the ghost of the vanished mayor was more alive than ever. The night deepened outside, but Clara's mind raced. Every whispered doubt, every fractured truth, led her closer to a reckoning that might consume them all. The hollow promise was unraveling, and so was the fragile trust she'd begun to build. She glanced once more at the scattered papers, the secret agreements waiting to be uncovered, and whispered to herself, "This town's story isn't finished. Not yet." And with that, Clara prepared for the difficult road ahead, where every ally might be an enemy, and every truth could cut deeper than a blade. The small mountain town seemed to hold its breath, the weight of silence settling heavily around every corner. Clara had been here less than a week, yet the shadows clinging to this place were already beginning to feel suffocating. Tonight, her hope rested on a weathered box. Maggie had promised to retrieve a box that might hold the key to understanding the mayor's mysterious disappearance. In the dim back room of the inn, dust particles drifted slow and lazy in the slanting amber light, spilling through a narrow window. Clara carefully unpacked the fragile contents of the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded brittle sheets of paper. The ink was faded, the edges yellowed and fragile, as if the very air threatened to tear the truth apart. This was no ordinary document. It was the original secret agreement each resident had signed decades ago, a pact that Mayor Elias Marrow had crafted in his early days to bind the town together, or so it seemed. Maggie sat nearby, her face worn and guarded, eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "It's been locked away for years," she whispered, "because no one wanted to remember what we promised." "Not really." Clara nodded, understanding that this fragile sheet of paper was more than just a legal instrument. It was a symbol of trust, fear, and control. As she traced the faded signatures, a cold realization settled in. The hollow promise was no mere formality. It was a mechanism that had kept the town in a tight grip, a secret binding that had silenced generations. Hours later, beneath the deepening twilight, Clara met with Deputy Sam Collins outside the town hall. The mountain air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant rush of a cold stream. Sam's brow was furrowed, the lines on his face deepened by the internal struggle Clara had glimpsed in their previous encounters. "You're poking a hornet's nest," Sam muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "These agreements, they were meant to protect us. At least, that's what Elias said. But now, with him gone, everything we held onto feels like it's crumbling." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Protection through fear isn't protection at all. This promise, it's not just paper, it's a chain, and it's time someone broke it." The tension between them was palpable, a reflection of the town's fractured soul. As the night deepened, Clara returned to her lodgings, the hollow promise echoing in her mind. The wind outside whispered through the trees like a ghostly warning, rattling window panes and stirring restless shadows. She lay awake, haunted by the weight of broken oaths and the knowledge that the town's silence was bought at a steep price. The discovery marked a turning point. The hollow promise was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible link to the mayor's disappearance. Clara felt the walls closing in, the stakes climbing higher with every secret uncovered. The town's history was not just buried in the mountains, it was etched into the very fabric of its people, and unearthing it would demand courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As dawn crept slowly over the peaks, Clara steeled herself for what lay ahead. The hollow promise was a shadow cast long and dark, but she was determined to follow it to its source, even if it meant confronting the very heart of the town's fragile peace. The silence was no longer just a void, it was a challenge, and Clara Hayes intended to answer it.
Clara Hayes sat quietly in a corner booth, her keen eyes fixed on the gathering crowd of town elders who had assembled in the back room. Their faces were etched with decades of secrets, lines deepened by worry and defiance. She had learned that beneath the town's picturesque exterior lay a brittle veneer, one that threatened to fracture with every probing question she asked. It began subtly that afternoon. Clara's visit to the town's archives had yielded a hint of the mayor's hidden agreements, but it was the wary glances and tight lips of the residents that told the real story. Now, as the elders muttered among themselves, their low voices carried the unmistakable edge of threat. Maggie, ever the cautious hostess, had reluctantly allowed Clara this glimpse into the town's core, but the tension was palpable. "We don't need outsiders stirring up old ghosts," one elder hissed, his sharp gaze flicking toward the detective. "Some things are better left alone." Clara's fingers tightened around her notebook. She had expected resistance, but the vehemence surprised her. "With all due respect," she replied, her tone steady yet firm, "knowing the truth is the only way this town can heal." A murmur rippled through the room, but before it could escalate, Maggie's voice broke through. "Elias kept us safe, yes, but at a cost. We all bear that cost." The conversation turned heated, voices rising in frustration and fear, as if the very air between them crackled with the weight of unspoken sins. Clara absorbed every word, every glance, aware that each elder harbored a stake in preserving the mayor's legacy or concealing its darker truths. Later that night, as Clara stepped outside to clear her mind, the sudden screech of tires shattered the mountain stillness. She turned just in time to see an unmarked car speed away, its headlights swallowed by the swirling fog. A crash echoed behind her, a loud bang against the side of her rental vehicle. Her heart pounded fiercely in the silence that followed. The message clear and chilling: some in this town would go to great lengths to keep their secrets. Back inside, Clara found herself alone at a small wooden table, the flickering oil lamp casting a wavering glow. She spread her notes before her, the fragile threads of the investigation beginning to weave into a dangerous tapestry. The weight of the mayor's hollow promise pressed down on her, its shadow long and oppressive. Her solitude was broken by a sudden knock. Deputy Sam Collins entered, his uniform damp from the rain outside. His eyes were dark pools of conflict. "Clara," he began, voice low and urgent, "you're poking a hornet's nest. They're watching, and not all of them want you to find answers." "I can't stop now," Clara said quietly, meeting his gaze. "This town deserves the truth, even if it's painful." Sam hesitated before nodding slowly. "Just be careful. Not everyone here plays by the rules anymore." The storm outside rumbled in agreement as Clara realized the investigation had crossed a threshold. The veil of silence was lifting, but the price of revelation was steep. and the mountain town's fragile peace was on the brink of collapse. With every secret clawed from the depths, the hollow promise that once bound the town tighter now threatened to unravel everything. Clara's resolve hardened. She would face the veiled threats and the shadows lurking in every corner because the truth was worth the risk, no matter the cost. As she prepared for the days ahead, a solitary thought anchored her amidst the rising storm. How many more lives had been shaped and shattered by the mayor's legacy? And who would stand behind her when the final reckoning came? Clara Hayes stepped carefully across the creaking wooden floor, the faint scent of cedar and old ink filling the air. The window, cracked and grimy from years of neglect, let in the waning light of the late afternoon, casting long shadows that danced across the room's cluttered surfaces. Her fingers traced the edges of a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn, the embossed letters nearly illegible. It had been tucked away behind a loose panel in the bookcase, hidden from casual eyes. Clara's pulse quickened as she carefully opened it, the fragile pages whispering secrets long buried. The handwriting was hurried, sometimes almost illegible, scrawled in black ink that had faded to a somber grey. Mayor Elias Marrow's voice came alive through his words, conflicted man wrestling with the immense burden of control he wielded over his mountain town. The journal spoke of promises made and broken, of sacrifices demanded in the name of protection, and of the loneliness that accompanied his role as both guardian and manipulator. Clara read passages where Elias confessed his fears of outside threats, economic interests, developers, and government officials who sought to exploit the town's natural resources. He had forged secret agreements with each resident, binding them in silence with a hollow promise of safety and prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, those promises corroded trust, breeding fear and resentment. The more Clara uncovered, the more the town's facade of unity began to crack. The journal revealed fractures in relationships, alliances forged through coercion rather than genuine loyalty. It was clear the mayor's disappearance was not merely a mystery, but a catalyst threatening to unravel decades of carefully maintained order. Later that evening, Clara sought out Maggie Thornton at the inn. The firelight flickered across Maggie's weathered face, highlighting the lines etched by years of worry and guarded secrets. The inn was warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the chill of the mountain air outside. Maggie's eyes, sharp and cautious, met Clara's as the detective laid out her discovery. "I always knew there were things Elias kept hidden," Maggie admitted, her voice low and steady. "But reading those words, it's a different kind of pain. The town's been complicit in keeping those secrets alive. We all bear some of the weight." Clara nodded, feeling the heavy truth settle between them. The town's silence was a shield, but also a prison. As night deepened, Clara stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The mountains loomed silently, their peaks shrouded in mist. The town below was cloaked in darkness, the windows of homes dim or shuttered. The discovery of the journal had shifted everything. What was once a puzzle was now a complex web of human frailty and moral ambiguity. She stood for a moment, gazing at the fading horizon. The mayor's intentions, though cloaked in manipulation, had been driven by a desperate desire to protect. Yet protection had come at a price: broken oaths, buried guilt, and a community held captive by its own past. Clara's mind raced with questions. How deep did the mayor's influence run? Who among the townspeople had truly benefited, and who had suffered in silence? And most pressing of all, would the truth bring healing, or would it tear the town apart? Her notebook lay open in her hand, the pages soon to be filled with new leads and revelations. But for now, the mountain town was quiet, holding its breath as the fragile peace it had known began to unravel. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows, eyes watched her every move, the threat of silence looming larger than ever. The hollow promise was no longer just a story, it was a call to action, and the consequences of answering it were yet to be seen. Clara folded the journal carefully, the weight of its revelations pressing down on her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more confrontations, and the unyielding pursuit of a truth that could not stay buried forever. She was ready to face whatever came next. The air was thick with unspoken words, the silence punctuated only by the faint creak of the old ceiling fan struggling against the stale mountain air. Sam's brow furrowed as he avoided Clara's steady gaze. His weather-beaten uniform hung loosely around his stocky frame, but the weight of the decision before him was evident in the tightness of his jaw and the subtle tremor in his hands. "You know, Clara," Sam began slowly, his voice low, "this town, it's not as simple as right and wrong. There are agreements that hold us all together. Breaking them could mean, well, chaos." Clara leaned forward, her fingers lightly tapping a worn notebook filled with notes, witness statements, and fragments of the secret agreement she'd uncovered days earlier. But what if those agreements are built on lies and fear? What kind of peace is that? Sam's eyes flickered with conflict. "I want to help. I do, but I'm caught in the middle. The elders trust me to keep order, to protect the town. And if the truth threatens that, I don't know where my loyalties should lie." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the distant murmur of voices gathering around the towns, and Clara could hear the rising tension, the sharp edges of anger and fear slicing through the chilly air. Later that evening, Clara stepped onto the porch of Maggie Thornton's, the warm glow from inside spilling onto the frosted steps. Inside, the local historian watched her approach with a guarded expression, eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. "You're stirring the pot, detective," Maggie said quietly, her voice steady but laced with warning. "Some here want to keep the past buried, no matter the cost." Clara nodded, understanding the delicate balance she was disrupting. But silence won't protect them forever. Not if the mayor's disappearance is a symptom of something deeper. Maggie's gaze softened just slightly. "Then you'll need allies. And right now, Sam's torn. You'll have to be careful whom you trust." The next day brought a confrontation that would linger in Clara's mind. Ellen Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, appeared at the sheriff's office, her presence as sharp as the mountain air. "You think you can come here, poke around, and unravel my father's legacy without consequences?" Ellen's voice was icy, her eyes flickering with resentment and pain. Clara met her gaze steadily. "I'm not here to judge, Ellen, just to find the truth." "Truth?" Ellen scoffed. "The truth is messy. It's full of broken promises and secrets. You're chasing ghosts." The tension crackled between them, a palpable reminder of the fractures running deep beneath the town's surface. That night, Clara sat alone in her temporary quarters, the flicker of a single lamp casting long shadows across her notes. The weight of her discoveries pressed down on her fractured loyalties, veiled threats, and the ever-present fear that the town might never forgive the past. Yet, beneath the weight, a stubborn ember of resolve glowed. She would navigate these fractured loyalties, seek out the hidden truths, and, if necessary, stand alone against the storm to bring justice to a town held hostage by its own secrets. But as the wind howled outside and the mountain darkness pressed in, Clara knew one thing for certain: the deeper she dug, the more dangerous her path would become. And in a town where every ally had a shadow, trust was the most fragile and precious thing of all. Her investigation was no longer just about finding a missing man. It had become a test of her own courage and conviction, one that would push her to the edge of what she believed was right, and force her to confront the hidden fractures that threatened to tear the community apart. And somewhere in the gathering shadows, someone was watching, waiting to see if Clara's pursuit of truth would be the town's salvation or its ruin. The fractured loyalties of the mountain town were more than just obstacles. They were the key to unraveling the mystery, but trusting the wrong person could be deadly. Clara's next move would determine not only her fate, but the fragile future of the town itself. And as the night deepened, a single unanswered question echoed in her mind. Who could she truly trust? The answer lay hidden in the fractured loyalties she was slowly beginning to piece together, and in the shadows that stretched ever longer across the mountain town. Inside the modest cabin she had rented on the outskirts, Detective Clara Hayes sat hunched over a worn desk, the flickering desk lamp casting a pale circle of light over a collection of photographs and notes. Her fingers trembled slightly as they traced the faded edges of a black and white photo of the face of her mentor, James Albright, smiling broadly, forever frozen in a moment of warmth and certainty. The weight of loss pressed heavily on Clara's chest, a familiar ache that refused to dull despite the passing years. The unresolved mystery of her mentor's death had driven her into law enforcement, fueled her determination to uncover cold truths buried beneath layers of silence. Yet here, in this remote mountain town steeped in its own secrets, Clara found herself confronting a reflection of that same pain-hidden, festering guilt entwined with broken promises. The sudden arrival of a bus stirred the quiet of the afternoon. Clara glanced up just as the doors hissed open, and a woman stepped down onto the cracked pavement. Elias Marrow moved with a purposeful grace that belied the weariness in her eyes. The late autumn cold bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her coat tighter, the muted tones of her clothing blending with the mist-wrapped town. Clara had heard whispers of the mayor's daughter estranged, embittered, a figure who had long avoided the place her father once ruled. Ellen's return was unexpected, a ripple in the still waters of the investigation. Their eyes met briefly from across the street, a silent acknowledgement of the storm about to break. Later that evening, the inn's back room held a tense atmosphere. The scent of aged wood and faint cigarette smoke clung to the air as Clara and Ellen sat facing one another across the scarred table. A single candle flickered between them, shadows dancing on the walls like restless spirits. "You don't know what you're walking into," Ellen said quietly, her voice edged with pain and warning. "This town isn't what you think. It's built on lies, on promises that were never meant to be kept." Clara met her gaze steadily. "Then help me understand, because the truth is the only way out of this." Ellen's laugh was bitter, a short, sharp sound filled with sorrow. "The truth? You think there's such a thing here? My father made sure the truth was the last thing anyone ever found." As their conversation unfolded, layers of resentment and fear peeled away, revealing a complex portrait of a man who was both protector and manipulator. Ellen's memories painted Elias Marrow not as a villain, but as a man burdened by impossible choices that had left scars on the town and on his own family. For Clara, the parallels to her own loss were stark. Both she and Ellen were haunted by men who had wielded power in different ways, leaving behind silence and unanswered questions. The detective's usual resolve wavered under the weight of empathy and doubt. Days later, Clara found herself wandering the deserted town square at dusk. The cold air was sharp in her lungs, and the dimming light stretched long shadows across the cracked pavement. The mountain wind carried whispers of the past. Voices she could almost hear, the promises made, the oaths broken, the guilt buried beneath the surface. She paused beneath the flickering street lamp, her breath clouding in the chilly air. The investigation was no longer just about finding Elias Marrow. It was about understanding the town's soul and confronting the ghosts that haunted them all. As night fell, Clara's thoughts returned to Ellen's words. The town's silence was more than fear, it was a pact of survival, fragile and dangerous. To break it would come at a cost, one that Clara was beginning to understand might echo far beyond the disappearance of a single man. Her notes lay open on the table, the ink smudged from hours of restless writing. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with pain and resistance, but also that the only way forward was through the shadows of guilt and grief. And as the wind howled through the mountain passes, Clara steeled herself ready to face the ghosts of the past, both hers and the town's, whatever the cost. The silence was broken not by answers, but by the growing certainty that the truth was close, just beyond reach, waiting to be uncovered in the quiet corners of a town bound by broken oaths and haunted promises. The shadows lengthened and Clara's resolve hardened. The journey was far from over. Tomorrow, she whispered to the darkness, I will find the truth. But in the stillness, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if that promise would be kept or if it, too, would vanish like so many before. Clara Hayes tightened the collar of her jacket against the chill mountain air, her breath visible in the crispness that seemed to seep into every corner of the town. She had been cautious in her approach to Jonas. The mechanic was known to be taciturn, someone who preferred wrenches to words. Yet a lead was a lead, and every fragment of information mattered. Pushing open the heavy metal door, Clara stepped into the garage, immediately enveloped by the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and metal. The space was chaotic, but functional workbenches cluttered with tools, shelves lined with spare parts, and a battered pickup truck hoisted on jacks in the center. Jonas was beneath the vehicle, his hands smeared with grease, a smudge streaking across his cheek as he worked with practiced precision. Jonas, Clara called softly, not wanting to startle him. He emerged slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, revealing a face weathered by years of mountain, sun, and hard labor. His eyes, sharp and observant, met hers. Detective Hayes, he nodded curtly. What brings you to my corner of the world? I'm hoping you can help me understand something about Mayor Marrow's last days in town, Clara began, carefully watching his reaction. Anything unusual you might have noticed? Visitors, odd requests? Jonas scratched the back of his neck, hesitating before speaking. The mayor did swing by about a week before he disappeared. Said his car was making a funny noise. Didn't think much of it at the time. Did anyone else come around then? Clara pressed. He glanced around the garage as if weighing how much to share. There was someone else, a man, tall, wore a dark coat, kept his hat low. Didn't say much, but he was with the mayor for a while. The mention of a stranger sent a ripple through Clara's mind. The town was a close-knit place. New faces were rare and often noted. This visitor could be the thread she needed to pull. Did you get a look at his face? Jonas shook his head. No, just the back of his head when he left. I know the mayor kept a lot to himself these days. Didn't like strangers much. Clara nodded, taking out her notebook. Anything else unusual about the mayor's car? Jonas hesitated, then walked over to the truck and reached into the glove compartment. He pulled out a small folded note, its edges worn and the ink faint but legible. I found this the day the mayor left the car here," he said, handing it to Clara. "Didn't know what to make of it until now." Clara unfolded the note carefully. The message was cryptic. "Midnight at the chapel. Trust no one but the promise." Her pulse quickened. The chapel was an old stone building on the edge of town, long since relegated to minor services and town meetings. Midnight meetings were unusual, especially secretive ones. "Who do you think wrote this?" Clara asked. Jonas shrugged. "No clue, but if the mayor was meeting someone here in secret, maybe it's connected to why he vanished." As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, the garage grew dim. Clara tucked the note safely into her coat pocket. "Thank you, Jonas. This helps more than you know." Outside, the mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the faint toll of church bells. Clara stepped out, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The town's quiet streets seemed to hold their breath, the weight of secrets pressing down with the coming night. Driving back to her cabin, Clara's mind raced. The mayor's disappearance was no longer just a local mystery, it was a puzzle wrapped in layers of silence and shadow. The note, the stranger, the secret meetings, all pieces converging toward a truth the town was desperate to keep hidden. As the headlights cut through the thickening fog, Clara felt the familiar stirrings of unease, but also a deepening resolve. Every step forward was a step closer to unraveling the hollow promise that had bound them all. Clara Hayes arrived early, her boots echoing softly against the worn floorboards as she took a seat near the back. The room was dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light overhead, casting long, jittering shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. The scent of pine from the mountain forests beyond mingled faintly with the dusty air inside, a reminder of the town's isolation and endurance. As more residents trickled in, the room filled with murmurs and low conversations, voices carrying the weight of history and unspoken tensions. Clara's gaze swept over the faces, weathered and lined elders, their eyes sharp yet clouded with years of loyalty. Younger men and women, their expressions tight with skepticism and frustration. A few children clinging to their parents, sensing the unease but not its cause. Deputy Sam Collins took his place beside Clara, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the crowd. "Not an easy crowd," he muttered under his breath. Clara nodded but said nothing, her mind already piecing together the fractured dynamics that had taken root in this mountain town. The disappearance of Mayor Elias Marrow had cracked open old wounds, and tonight those wounds would bleed into the light. The meeting began with Maggie Thornton stepping forward. Her presence commanded attention despite her quiet demeanor. "I've lived here all my life," she began, voice steady but tinged with defensiveness. "Mayor Marrow kept this town safe when no one else would. We owe him that much, at least." A ripple of murmurs followed, some nods from the older residents, but the younger crowd shifted uneasily. Ellen Moreau, standing near the back, crossed her arms tightly. When given the floor, her voice was sharp, carrying a trace of bitterness. "Safe or silent. This town has been held hostage by his promises, by secrets that stifle any hope for real change." Voices rose quickly, the room erupting into a cacophony of accusations and defenses. Clara raised her hand, the gavel-like gesture cutting through the noise. "Please," she urged, "we're here to understand what really happened, not to argue." But the divisions were too deep. Old Mr. Grayson, a grizzled man with a tremor in his hands, spoke over the crowd. "You don't understand the mountain. You don't understand what it takes to keep it alive. Elias did what had to be done." A young woman shouted back, "By breaking us apart, by hiding the truth." Clara's notebook, filled with conflicting testimonies, each story painting a different picture of the mayor as a protector, a tyrant, a man trapped by his own promises. The town's collective memory was fractured like the mountain paths that twisted through their homes. After the meeting, Clara stepped outside into the biting night. The wind whipped through the skeletal branches of the pines, carrying with it the whisper of secrets long buried. She pulled her jacket tighter, the cold seeping through to her bones. The town was a puzzle with missing pieces, and every piece she found only revealed more gaps. Later, in the dim light of the inn's common room, Clara sat across from Maggie Thornton. The innkeeper poured 2 cups of bitter coffee, the steam curling like ghostly fingers in the low light. "You saw more than you let on tonight," Clara said gently, watching Maggie's eyes flicker with something unspoken. Maggie sighed, her weathered face softening. Elias wasn't perfect. None of us are. But he believed he was saving us all, even if it meant making promises he couldn't keep. The weight of those words hung heavy between them. Clara understood then that the mayor's legacy was not just a matter of facts and evidence, it was a living, breathing force that shaped this town's very soul. As she prepared to leave, Clara glanced once more at the silent mountains looming in the distance. Beneath their serene beauty lay the tangled roots of betrayal and broken oaths, and Clara knew her path forward would not be easy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the small, folded piece of paper found slipped beneath the door earlier that evening. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, hurried, almost jagged, and the words chilled her more than the cold air creeping under the door. "Stop digging, or you'll be next." No signature, no hint of who had sent it, just a stark, brutal warning. Clara's breath hitched, the room suddenly feeling far smaller, the shadows deeper. She stared at the note, the weight of it pressing down like the mountain peaks themselves. The unease that had hovered since her arrival now crystallized into a cold certainty. Someone in this town was desperate to keep the truth hidden, and they were willing to threaten her life to do so. Her mind raced back over the day's encounters. Maggie Thornton's guarded glances, Deputy Sam Collins' tight-lipped evasions, the thin smiles of the townsfolk who had crept away too quickly when she asked too many questions. The layers of silence and fear wrapped around this place like a cloak, and now it felt as if the cloak was tightening around her throat. Later, at Maggie's inn, the warm, wood-paneled interior offered a fragile comfort. The scent of pine and simmering stew filled the air, but beneath that homely veneer, tension simmered. Maggie's eyes flickered with wary concern as Clara recounted the note. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Clara," Maggie said quietly, her voice low enough to only reach her. "There's history here that folks don't want disturbed. The mayor's promise binds more than just loyalty. It binds fear." Clara nodded, studying the older woman's weathered face and the flicker of something like regret behind her eyes. Maggie was an ally, but one who carried the scars of the town's long-buried secrets. The next morning, Clara met with Deputy Sam Collins in the musty police station. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and the smell of stale coffee hung heavy. Sam's expression was guarded, his eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "This place, it's not what it seems," Sam murmured, voice thick with conflict. "I want to help, Clara, but you have to understand, the town protects itself, sometimes in ways you'd never expect." Their conversation was a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. Sam's divided loyalty was a constant undercurrent, complicating Clara's few alliances and reminding her that the investigation was as much about navigating the town's fractured relationships as it was about uncovering facts. As the day waned, Clara found herself walking the forest trails edging the town, the tall pines whispering overhead. The dense silence felt alive, as if the very trees watched her progress, bearing witness to secrets too heavy to speak. The cold mountain air bit at her skin, and every snapped twig or distant rustle made her heart leap. Alone, out here, the isolation was palpable, but so was her resolve. She paused beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient pine, staring up into the darkening sky. The stars were just beginning to prick through the twilight, but the darkness below pressed close. A reminder that the truth she sought was buried deep, and the cost of unearthing it might be higher than she ever imagined. Back in her room that night, Clara placed the note carefully into her notebook. It was a warning, yes, but also a challenge. She would not be deterred. The town's secrets had claws, but so did she. As sleep finally claimed her, the whispered threat echoed in her mind. A haunting refrain against the mountain silence: "Stop digging, or you'll be next." And Clara knew, with grim certainty, that she was already in too deep to turn back now. The promise was hollow, but the danger was all too real. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of the vanished mayor's legacy, Clara chose to press forward into darkness, into fear, and into the very heart of the town's deepest, most dangerous secrets. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the small, folded piece of paper found slipped beneath the door earlier that evening. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, hurried, almost jagged, and the words chilled her more than the cold air creeping under the door. "Stop digging, or you'll be next." No signature, no hint of who had sent it, just a stark, brutal warning. Clara's breath hitched, the room suddenly feeling far smaller, the shadows deeper. She stared at the note, the weight of it pressing down like the mountain peaks themselves. The unease that had hovered since her arrival now crystallized into a cold certainty. Someone in this town was desperate to keep the truth hidden, and they were willing to threaten her life to do so. Her mind raced back over the day's encounters. Maggie Thornton's guarded glances, Deputy Sam Collins' tight-lipped evasions, the thin smiles of the townsfolk who had crept away too quickly when she asked too many questions. The layers of silence and fear wrapped around this place like a cloak, and now it felt as if the cloak was tightening around her throat. Later, at Maggie's inn, the warm, wood-paneled interior offered a fragile comfort. The scent of pine and simmering stew filled the air, but beneath that homely veneer, tension simmered. Maggie's eyes flickered with wary concern as Clara recounted the note. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Clara," Maggie said quietly, her voice low enough to only reach her. "There's history here that folks don't want disturbed. The mayor's promise binds more than just loyalty. It binds fear." Clara nodded, studying the older woman's weathered face and the flicker of something like regret behind her eyes. Maggie was an ally, but one who carried the scars of the town's long-buried secrets. The next morning, Clara met with Deputy Sam Collins in the musty police station. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and the smell of stale coffee hung heavy. Sam's expression was guarded, his eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "This place, it's not what it seems," Sam murmured, voice thick with conflict. "I want to help, Clara, but you have to understand, the town protects itself, sometimes in ways you'd never expect." Their conversation was a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. Sam's divided loyalty was a constant undercurrent, complicating Clara's few alliances and reminding her that the investigation was as much about navigating the town's fractured relationships as it was about uncovering facts. As the day waned, Clara found herself walking the forest trails edging the town, the tall pines whispering overhead. The dense silence felt alive, as if the very trees watched her progress, bearing witness to secrets too heavy to speak. The cold mountain air bit at her skin, and every snapped twig or distant rustle made her heart leap. Alone, out here, the isolation was palpable, but so was her resolve. She paused beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient pine, staring up into the darkening sky. The stars were just beginning to prick through the twilight, but the darkness below pressed close. A reminder that the truth she sought was buried deep, and the cost of unearthing it might be higher than she ever imagined. Back in her room that night, Clara placed the note carefully into her notebook. It was a warning, yes, but also a challenge. She would not be deterred. The town's secrets had claws, but so did she. As sleep finally claimed her, the whispered threat echoed in her mind. A haunting refrain against the mountain silence: "Stop digging, or you'll be next." And Clara knew, with grim certainty, that she was already in too deep to turn back now. The promise was hollow, but the danger was all too real. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of the vanished mayor's legacy, Clara chose to press forward into darkness, into fear, and into the very heart of the town's deepest, most dangerous secrets. The room was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners where dust motes floated lazily in the weak afternoon light. Sam Collins sat behind his desk, shoulders slumped, his weather-beaten face drawn tight with tension. His eyes, usually sharp and alert, flickered with hesitation as Clara took a seat across from him. "Sam," Clara began, her voice soft but firm, "I need to understand why some of your statements don't add up. The timeline you gave me about the mayor's last known movements there are gaps." Sam rubbed his temple, his fingers trembling slightly. "Clara, you have to understand, it's not so simple. This town, it's like a family. Sometimes, protecting the family means keeping secrets." Clara studied him carefully. "But you swore an oath to uphold the law. That means protecting the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." He looked up, eyes meeting hers briefly before darting away. "The elders, they've been here longer than I have. They built this place, and they've done what they thought was right to keep it safe. The mayor's disappearance has shaken everything. If this investigation tears the town apart, then we're left with silence and fear," Clara said quietly. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a worn clock on the wall. Finally, Sam exhaled, a sound heavy with resignation. "I'm caught in the middle, Clara. I want to help you, but I don't want to betray the people I've known all my life." Later that evening, the cold mountain air nipped at Clara's cheeks as she met Sam outside the local diner. Their breath formed pale clouds between them as she pressed him again on the inconsistencies. "You said you were at the station when the mayor disappeared, but I have witnesses who saw you near the town hall," she challenged. Sam's jaw tightened. "I was there, but not for what you think." "Then what?" He glanced around nervously. "There are things I can't say, not yet. People's lives depend on it." Frustration flickered in Clara's eyes. "I need facts, Sam, not half-truths." He looked away, the weight of his silence heavier than any confession. Back in his small cabin that night, Sam sat alone, the flickering light of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He held an old, faded photograph in his hands. Mayor Elias Marrow, standing proudly beside a younger version of himself and his family. Tears pricked his eyes as memories surged. Times when the mayor had been a mentor, a protector, and when the lines between right and wrong had blurred. "What have we become?" he whispered to the empty room. Days passed, and the tension between Clara and Sam remained taut. Yet beneath the surface, an uneasy truce began to form. One dawn, they met quietly in the town square, the first light casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. "I don't trust everyone in this town," Sam admitted. "But I trust you, Clara." She nodded, the hint of a fragile alliance forming between them. "Then help me find the truth, no matter where it leads." Sam hesitated, then gave a slow nod. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and moral ambiguity. But for the first time, he was ready to take a step toward clarity, toward justice. The town's silence was broken, but at what cost? As Clara watched Sam walk away, she knew the struggle for truth was far from over. Somewhere beneath the surface, darker forces stirred, and the fragile fabric of the mountain town threatened to unravel completely. And in that dawning light, with alliances shifting like shadows, Clara felt the weight of the hollow promise more keenly than ever. The question remained, would Sam's allegiance hold, or would the town's secrets prove too powerful to overcome? The answer would come soon enough, and when it did, everything would change. Clara folded her notebook and glanced once more toward the distant peaks. The investigation was entering its most dangerous phase yet. She steeled herself. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it head-on, even if it meant standing alone. Clara Hayes sat stiffly across from Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, whose sharp gaze seemed to cut through the quiet with a force more palpable than any spoken word. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she folded and refolded a crumpled tissue. Her auburn hair pulled back loosely, revealing the weary lines etched around her eyes. The silence stretched taut before Ellen finally spoke, her voice low and laced with a bitterness that betrayed years of pent-up anguish. "You think you know him," Ellen began, eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "But you don't. My father, Elias Marrow, wasn't the man the town paints him to be. Not the protector, not the benevolent leader. There was another side, one that the town's secrets have buried deep." Clara leaned forward, her sharp intuition compelling her to listen intently. "What do you mean?" Ellen's gaze darkened, memories surfacing painfully. The promises he made, the hollow ones, they weren't just about control. They were about fear, silence, and sacrifice. He demanded loyalty, yes, but at what cost? Families broken, lives ruined. I was one of them. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of Ellen's confession. Clara's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the mayor's influence that had so far been shrouded in ambiguity. The portrait of Elias Marrow as a complex, even manipulative figure was no longer just an abstract theory, but a deeply personal reality for his own daughter. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the creak of the library door. Deputy Sam Collins entered, his weather-beaten uniform a stark contrast to the fragile tension in the room. Ellen's eyes narrowed immediately, suspicion flaring. "And what are you doing here?" she demanded, voice hardening. Sam's expression was guarded but earnest. "I'm here to help, Ellen. We all want the truth, even if it's hard to face." But Ellen wasn't convinced. Help or protect the town's lies. The accusation hung in the air, a reminder of the divided loyalties that Clara had sensed from the start. The deputy's conflicted stance was emblematic of the town itself, caught between preserving the past and confronting its buried sins. Later, in the cramped kitchen of Ellen's childhood home, the atmosphere was charged with raw emotion. The flickering light of a single bulb cast shifting shadows on the peeling wallpaper as Ellen recounted moments. From her youth, the cold silences, the whispered warnings, the unspoken threats that defined her father's reign. He wasn't just a mayor, she said bitterly. He was a tyrant in disguise. Clara found herself caught between empathy and professional detachment, struggling to reconcile the warmth she had glimpsed in some town elders with the harsh truths Ellen revealed. The complexity of the mayor's legacy unraveled further with each revelation, leaving Clara to navigate a labyrinth of moral ambiguity. Outside, the mountain sky had darkened to a slate grey, rain beginning to fall in steady, unrelenting sheets. Ellen stood silently by the window, watching the drops race down the glass. The weight of her pain was as heavy and relentless as the storm, a tangible reminder of the town's fractured soul. This chapter marked a turning point in Clara's investigation. Ellen's painful memories peeled back layers of deceit and control, exposing the mayor's darker side and the personal cost borne by those closest to him. The fragile trust Clara had built with the community now teetered on the edge, threatening to shatter under the strain of truths long concealed. As Clara prepared to delve deeper into the town's secrets, the question lingered: how many more lies lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed? The path forward was fraught with peril, but Clara's resolve hardened. To uncover the truth, she would have to confront not only the town's demons, but her own as well. The chapter closed on a note of uneasy anticipation. Ellen's confession had opened a door that could not be closed, and Clara knew that crossing its threshold would change everything. The mountain town held its breath, suspended between the shadows of the past and the uncertain light of revelation, as the detective took her next steps into the heart of the mystery. The mountain air was crisp, but the silence around the old town hall was suffocating. As she pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of aged wood and dust greeted her like a warning. The building, once a proud symbol of the mayor's authority, now seemed like a crypt guarding memories better left undisturbed. Her footsteps echoed softly on the creaking floorboards as she made her way toward the cellar entrance. The metal hatch groaned in protest when she lifted it, revealing a narrow staircase swallowed by darkness. Clara switched on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness like a lifeline. One cautious step after another, she descended into the shadows. The cellar was spacious, yet cramped with decades of forgotten belongings. Crates stacked with yellowed papers, broken furniture, and dust-covered artifacts filled the room. Clara's eyes caught a series of photographs pinned on the far wall, their edges curled and stained. Faces stared back at her town elders, smiling and grimacing alike. Some with Mayor Elias Marrow himself, others with expressions that hinted at unease beneath forced joviality. She reached out to touch one, a faded image of the mayor shaking hands with a group of residents, beneath which a note in a trembling hand read, "The price of peace is silence." Her heart quickened. This was no ordinary history lesson. It was a confession. Clara carefully sifted through the documents, uncovering letters and contracts that seemed to contradict the official narrative the town had long repeated. These papers revealed a series of secret agreements, each binding residents to the mayor's will under veiled threats and promises of protection. The hollow promise wasn't just rhetoric, it was a mechanism of control, a web woven through fear and obligation. She was so absorbed that the creak of footsteps startled her. Maggie Thornton appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "I see you found the town's dirty laundry," Maggie said softly, her voice a mixture of resignation and warning. Clara nodded, closing the folder carefully. This is why no one talks," Maggie continued. "Because once you know, you can't unsee. It tears the town apart." That night at the inn, over cups of bitter coffee, Maggie shared whispered stories, fragments of memories passed down. Tales of quiet deals made in the shadows, and the mayor's iron grip disguised as protection. Yet, even as Clara felt an ally in Maggie, the tension thickened elsewhere. The rain hammered the windows of the sheriff's office, where Deputy Sam Collins awaited her. His face was drawn, eyes flickering with conflict. "Detective," he said, voice low, "you don't know what you're stirring. This town knits held together by those promises, broken or not. Dig too deep, and you'll bring the whole mountain down on us." Clara met his gaze, unwavering. "I have to find the truth, Sam, no matter the cost." He sighed, rain dripping from his soaked hat. "Be careful. Not everyone wants to see that truth." The following day, Clara sought out Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter. She found her standing alone at the town's edge, the fog curling around her like a shroud. Ellen's voice was raw as she spoke of the man she barely knew, her father, a figure both revered and reviled. "He built this town with his promises," she said, "but those promises were chains. I stayed away because I couldn't live under his shadow. Now, with him gone, I'm not sure what's left for any of us." The wind tugged at her coat, mirroring the turmoil in her eyes. Clara felt the weight of the town's history pressing down on her, the secrets, the lies, the broken oaths. Each revelation was a fracture in the community's fragile peace, threatening to unleash the fury of years of buried guilt and fear. As she left the cliffside, Clara knew the path ahead was fraught with peril. The shadows she had uncovered were only the beginning. The town's darkest corners still held secrets waiting to be dragged into the light, and someone was determined to keep them hidden. The whispers in the shadows were growing louder, and Clara could no longer ignore the danger closing in. She tightened her jacket against the chill, steeling herself for the battles to come. The hollow promise had begun to unravel, and the mountain town would never be the same. With each step back toward the heart of the town, Clara felt the eyes of the past watching her, silent, accusing, relentless. The game had changed. The secrets were no longer safe, and the truth would demand a reckoning. The faint scent of dust and old cedar would crept into her senses, a stark contrast to the fresh mountain air she had grown accustomed to. Inside, a restless murmur coursed through the gathered crowd, a mixture of suspicion, fear, and barely concealed anger. The townsfolk had come together, drawn by the gravity of the mayor's disappearance and Clara's relentless probing into their past. Tonight, the fragile veneer of community was about to crack. Rows of folding chairs had been hastily arranged, some occupied, others abandoned as conversations sparked and died like flickering embers. Clara's eyes swept across the sea of faces, each etched with the weight of secrets. Maggie Thornton sat near the front, her weathered features taut but composed, fingers nervously clutching the edge of the wooden table. Beside her, Deputy Sam Collins looked out of place in his rumpled uniform, his posture stiff with unease. Clara cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but calm. "I know this isn't easy. Mayor Marrow's disappearance has left a hole in this town, and my investigation has raised questions that are uncomfortable but necessary." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. From the back, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Uncomfortable. It's tearing the town apart." A man, middle-aged, with grizzled hair and a face reddened by years of mountain winds, stood, his fists clenched at his sides. Clara nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I understand the strain this places on everyone, but the only way forward is through honesty." Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, emerged from the shadows near the doorway, her sharp eyes locked on Clara. She stepped forward, her voice laced with bitterness. "Honesty. The town has been built on lies and broken promises. My father's legacy isn't the noble one you want to believe." A hush fell. Maggie's eyes flickered to Ellen, then back to Clara, as if silently warning her to tread carefully. Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down. "Ellen," Clara said gently, "your perspective is important. This investigation isn't about defending anyone, but seeking the truth." Ellen's gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again. "The truth is, the mayor's promises were chains, not shields, and some here still cling to those chains out of fear." Deputy Sam Collins stepped forward, attempting to bridge the widening gap. "Let's not forget, we're all part of this community. We owe it to ourselves to find common ground." But the room shifted uneasily. Voices rose, some calling out accusations, others pleading for calm. The invisible lines drawn by loyalty, fear, and guilt became starkly apparent. Clara's heart pounded as she realized the depth of the town's fracture. Each revelation, each question she posed, threatened to unravel what little cohesion remained. The mayor's hollow promise had not only bound the town, but had sown seeds of distrust that now bloomed in full. As the meeting wore on, Clara found herself caught between the town's defenders and dissenters. Maggie offered cautious insights, her loyalty to the town tempered by a growing fear of what the truth might unleash. Ellen's sharp words challenged Clara's assumptions, forcing her to confront uncomfortable realities. Sam's conflicted role added a layer of complexity, his allegiance torn between maintaining order and supporting Clara's quest. When the meeting finally adjourned, the air outside was thick with unresolved tension. Clara stepped into the cold mountain night, the chill seeping through her jacket. She inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and damp earth grounding her amid the storm of emotions. The distant howl of wind echoed the unrest she felt within, a reminder that the path ahead would be treacherous. Trust was fractured, alliances fragile, and the lines drawn tonight would shape the course of her investigation and the town's future. Clara knew she couldn't afford to lose hope. But as she looked back at the dimly lit hall, shadows flickering behind the windows, she understood that every step forward might come at a cost greater than she had anticipated. The hollow promise was no longer just a secret buried beneath the mountain. It was a living fault line, ready to fracture everything it touched, and Clara was standing right at its edge. The night stretched on, and with it, the uneasy silence of a town caught between past sins and uncertain tomorrows. She tightened her grip on her notebook, determination burning brighter than ever. The lines had been drawn. Now, it was time to see who would stand and who would fall. The following days promised no reprieve. Clara's investigation would stir deeper waters, and the town's fragile peace would be tested beyond endurance. Yet amid the turmoil, a quiet resolve took root in her chest. The truth would not remain hidden, not on her watch. But in this mountain town, wrapped in shadows and broken oaths, every truth revealed came with a price, and Clara was ready to pay it. The secret agreement, a pact etched in ink and silence, lay sprawled across the rough-hewn table like a ghost from the past. Each faded signature was a testament to the promises that had bound this mountain town together. Promises whispered in fear and sealed with a weight heavier than any oath should bear. She leaned back, her breath shallow, the wood beneath her scraping softly against the chair. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the sharp scent of cold earth and pine resin. Clara's mind churned, the lines between right and wrong blurring in the dim light. Elias Marrow's disappearance was no longer just a missing person. It was a revelation of a fragile society built on deception and control. The mayor had been both protector and puppet master, and the town was his stage. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Father James entered quietly, his presence calm but heavy with unspoken burdens. His eyes met Clara's, reflecting a mixture of sympathy and guarded knowledge. "They say the truth can set you free," he began, his voice low and steady. "But here, sometimes it only fractures what little peace we have left." Clara nodded slowly, folding the document carefully. "Disagreement. It's more than a contract. It's a cage. Everyone here has been living behind masks, afraid to break the silence." Father James sighed, stepping closer. "I've heard confessions, whispered prayers, and the weight of guilt in this town runs deep. The oaths were meant to protect, but they've become shackles." The detective's gaze hardened, and yet no one wants to admit it. The mayor kept the town together, but at what cost? How many more lies are buried beneath his promises? Outside the window, the sky had darkened to a steely grey, the first hints of a coming storm. Clara rose, her resolve solidifying like the cold mountain stone. "I have to understand it all. The broken oaths, the silence, the fear. Only then can I find the truth." Father James nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Be careful, Clara. Some truths aren't ready to be uncovered." Later that afternoon, Clara met Deputy Sam Collins by the edge of the forest. The mountain air was crisp, each breath sharp and visible in the chill. Sam's weather-beaten face was etched with conflict, his loyalty pulled between the town's elders and Clara's relentless pursuit. "You're stirring up things that should have stayed buried," Sam warned, voice low, eyes darting nervously toward the trees. "This town survives on those promises, broken or not. If you push too hard, there'll be consequences." Clara met his gaze steadily. "And if I don't, what then? They keep hiding behind their silence while the truth rots beneath their feet." Sam's jaw tightened. "You're not like the rest of us. You don't understand what it means to live with this weight every day." "I'm starting to." Clara's voice was quiet but resolute, "and I won't let fear keep us from facing it." Their conversation ended in uneasy silence, the forest around them whispering secrets in the wind. That evening, Clara returned to the inn where Maggie Thornton awaited her in the dim light of the common room. Maggie's eyes, sharp and tired, held the weight of years spent guarding the town's secrets. Her voice wavered as she spoke, reluctant but compelled by Clara's persistence. There were promises made, yes, Maggie admitted, but they weren't just words. They were survival. The mayor gave us safety, but he demanded loyalty in return. Loyalty that sometimes meant turning away from the truth. Clara leaned forward, urgency threading her tone. "And what happens when those promises break? When the safety is an illusion?" Maggie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Then you're left with fear and guilt that never fades. We're all bound by those broken oaths, and some of us will do anything to keep them buried." The room seemed to close in around Clara, the weight of the town's collective guilt pressing down like the heavy mountain mist. But beneath the suffocating silence, a fire kindled within her, the fire of determination and unyielding truth. As night deepened, Clara's thoughts spiraled through the promises made and broken, the faces of those she'd met, and the fragile threads of trust that still held the town together. The hollow promise was more than a secret. It was the town's very lifeblood, and exposing it would come at a cost. Yet, despite the danger and the shadows gathering close, Clara knew she could not turn back. The weight of those oaths was hers to bear now, and she would carry it to the end, no matter what lay ahead. A distant howl echoed in the mountain night, a reminder that beneath the stillness, the town's secrets were restless, waiting to be unearthed. Clara sat across from the innkeeper, the flickering firelight dancing in Maggie's keen eyes as she spoke in clipped, cautious tones. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the chill that had settled in Clara's bones since arriving in the mountain town. Maggie's voice wavered as she recounted fragments of the mayor's influence, tales woven with loyalty, fear, and a palpable reluctance to betray the silent pact that still held the town in its grip. Elias, he had a way of making you feel like you belonged, Maggie said, her gaze distant. But it was never just goodwill. There was always something else. Something we didn't fully understand. Clara nodded slowly, her mind racing to connect the pieces. The mayor's hold on the town was more than political. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives, a hollow promise that both protected and imprisoned them. Maggie's guarded warmth was a fragile bridge, one Clara knew she had to cross carefully. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of Father James's office, the atmosphere shifted. The soft glow of afternoon light filtering through stained glass bathed the room in a gentle hue, lending an almost sacred stillness to the space. Father James, tall and slender, met Clara's weary eyes with calm understanding. His voice was low, steady, offering guidance without judgment. "The town carries its sins like a shroud," he said, folding his hands over a well-worn Bible. "But within that burden lies the possibility of grace. It's not an easy path, detective. Truth can heal, but it can also wound." Clara felt a flicker of solace in his words, a reminder that even amidst the shadows of broken oaths and buried guilt, there could be light. Yet, the priest's quiet counsel also underscored the complexity of what lay ahead, the delicate balance between exposing secrets and respecting the fragile lives entwined with them. The fragile alliances Clara dared to forge, however, were tested sharply in the sheriff's office. Deputy Sam Collins, his weather-beaten uniform a stark contrast to his internal turmoil, met Clara with a mixture of pragmatism and guarded mistrust. Their conversation was terse, voices low but edged with tension, as rain drummed insistently against the window pane. "You're stirring up old ghosts, Clara," Sam warned, his jaw tight. "This town's got its ways. You don't just walk in and tear down walls without consequences." Clara met his gaze evenly. "I'm not here to tear down, Sam. I'm here to understand, to find the truth." But the rift between them was palpable, a fracture that threatened to undermine the investigation as loyalties pulled Sam in conflicting directions. The deputy's allegiance to the town elders clashed with his duty, and Clara knew this tension could unravel the fragile network of trust she struggled to build. As night settled over the mountain town, Clara found herself alone on the porch of Maggie's inn. The cool breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the distant, haunting howl of a lone wolf. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, a stark reminder of the isolation she felt. Yet beneath that solitude burned a quiet resolve. The alliances forming were tentative, fragile shards of trust pieced together from fear and hope alike. Maggie's guarded insights, Father James's steady counsel, and even the strained, uneasy connection with Deputy Sam, all were fragments Clara would have to navigate carefully. Her mind churned with questions. Who could she truly rely on? How deep did the mayor's influence run? And most pressing of all, could the town face the truth without tearing itself apart? Clara's fingers tightened around her notebook as she stared into the dark, the weight of the hollow promise pressing closer. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with danger and moral ambiguity. But one thing was clear: the fragments of trust she gathered now might be the only hope for justice in a town held captive by its own silence. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, waiting to see if Clara would break or become part of the unspoken pact herself. The night deepened, the mountain air sharp and still. Clara rose from the porch, her breath misting in the cold. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the picture was far from complete. The fragile trust she had begun to build was a double-edged sword, and she knew the coming days would test every ounce of her resolve. With a final glance toward the sleeping town, Clara stepped back inside. Tomorrow, the search for truth would continue, and with it, the delicate dance between revelation and ruin. The hollow promise was still alive, and so was the danger it carried. The question was, who would pay the price when it finally shattered? Detective Clara Hayes moved carefully along the narrow path skirting the edge of town, her boots crunching softly on a carpet of brittle leaves and pine needles. She had insisted on walking alone, despite Deputy Sam Collins' protests, a habit born from years of solitary reflection. A way to process the heavy weight of her investigations. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air, mingling with the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke from distant chimneys. The town below twinkled faintly, a cluster of amber lights caught in the valley's embrace. It was peaceful, or so it seemed. Clara's mind churned with the fragments of the case. The mayor's disappearance, the hollow promise binding every resident, the veiled threats that had begun to shadow her steps. She'd sensed the growing unease in the town's atmosphere, but nothing had prepared her for what came next. Without warning, a dark figure lunged from behind a gnarled pine, shattering the stillness. Clara barely had time to react before a violent blow sent her sprawling onto the leaf-strewn ground. Pain exploded along her side as she struggled to push her attacker away, her heart hammering in a frantic rhythm. "Who's there?" she gasped, trying to scramble upright, but the assailant was relentless, a blur of shadow and fury. The cold mountain air bit into her skin as she fought for breath, the world tilting dangerously. Her attacker's grip tightened, a rough hand clamping over her mouth to stifle her cries. Panic surged through her veins, sharp and icy. Yet beneath the fear, a stubborn resolve flared. She would not be silenced, not by threats, not by violence. Suddenly, a shout pierced the night. "Clara, hold on." The heavy footsteps of Deputy Sam Collins thundered through the underbrush, followed by Maggie Thornton's sharp voice. The assailant hesitated, the moment fractured by the arrival of reinforcements. Sam's hand flashed out, a solid strike that sent the attacker staggering backward into the shadows. Maggie's steady presence beside Sam was a bomb, her keen eyes scanning the darkness for any further threat. "Are you okay?" Sam asked urgently, his voice rough with concern as he helped Clara to her feet. She nodded weakly, wincing as pain radiated from her side. "I'm fine, just shaken." Back at the inn, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the cold terror of the attack. Clara sat wrapped in a thick blanket, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across her face. Around her, the low murmur of voices held a tension that betrayed the town's fragile calm. Maggie poured a cup of tea, setting it gently before Clara. "You're stirring up more than dust." "Detective," she said quietly, eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and resignation. "Some secrets aren't meant to see the light." Clara met her gaze steadily. "Then it's all the more reason to find the truth." The attack was a brutal reminder that the hollow promise was not just a metaphor, it was a weapon wielded by those desperate to maintain control. The town's silence was enforced with threats and violence, a shadowy web that Clara was now deeply entangled in. As dawn approached, Clara's mind raced with questions. Who had sent the attacker? Was it one of the town elders, desperate to protect their legacy? Or someone else, lurking in the shadows with their own agenda? The stakes had never been higher. Every step forward risked the wrath of unseen enemies. Yet Clara's determination only hardened. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The echoes of the threat would haunt Herb. They would not break her. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the weight of secrets long buried and the promise of reckoning to come. And somewhere in the darkness, eyes watched and waited. The game had changed. The hollow promise was no longer just a mystery to solve, it was a danger to survive. Clara's resolve was tested like never before. She would have to navigate the treacherous path ahead with courage, cunning, and the unyielding will to shine light into the town's darkest corners. The night had spoken, and Clara was listening. The room was silent save for the occasional creak of old wood and the soft rustle of pages turning. The yellowed paper smelled of age and secrecy, the ink faded but still readable. Clara's eyes scanned each line carefully, her mind racing to piece together the mayor's true intentions. Mayor Elias Marrow's handwriting was meticulous, each entry a careful construction of thoughts and justifications. Clara's heart pounded as she read passages that revealed more than just a man's diary. They exposed the foundation of a pact that had bound the town for decades. The mayor wrote candidly about promises made in shadows, about how the town's prosperity was secured not through open governance but through fear, a hollow promise that demanded silence and obedience. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The pact was no mere agreement. It was a mechanism of control. The residents had traded their autonomy for safety, bound by oaths that were never meant to be broken. And now, with the mayor vanished, that fragile order was unraveling. Later that evening, Clara found herself in the back room of Maggie Thornton's. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and lingering smoke from the hearth. Maggie sat across from her, eyes sharp but shadowed with decades of guarded pain. The flicker of candlelight cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. "You want to know what that promise really was?" Maggie said quietly, her voice heavy with regret. "It wasn't about protection alone. It was about keeping us all in line. Fear was the leash, and the mayor held it tight." Clara listened, absorbing the reluctant truths. Maggie's words confirmed the journal's revelations. The pact was a tool wielded not just to protect, but to manipulate. The mayor had fostered a culture of silence, where loyalty was enforced by the threat of exposure and ruin. The next day, the tension in town was palpable. Clara met Deputy Sam Collins outside the town hall, the rain soaking through their coats. His face was etched with conflict, the lines of loyalty and doubt battling openly in his eyes. "You're stirring things that have been buried for a reason," Sam said, voice low and urgent. "This town's built on that promise. Tear it apart, and everything falls apart. You have to think about what that means for all of us." Thunder rumbled overhead, mirroring the storm raging within Sam. Clara met his gaze steadily, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with danger, not only for the town but for herself. Seeking solace, Clara later visited the quiet sanctuary of the town's church. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, coloring the pews in hues of red, blue, and gold. Father James stood by the altar, his presence calm and steady. "Sometimes," he said softly, "truth is a heavy burden, Clara, but it's also the light that can guide us out of darkness." His words offered a brief reprieve from the chaos. Here, amid the prayers and echoes of faith, Clara found a moment of clarity and the strength to carry on. As the chapter closed, Clara sat once more with the journal, the mayor's words etched into her memory. The hollow promise was no longer a secret. It was a challenge, a riddle demanding resolution. The town's fragile peace was shattered, and the cost of uncovering the truth was only just beginning to reveal itself. She knew one thing for certain: exposing the hollow promise would change everything, and nothing in the mountain town would ever be the same again. The question that haunted her was clear. How far would the town go to protect the lie? And what price would she pay to see justice done? The storm outside had yet to pass. Clara Hayes sat at a battered wooden desk, her fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph of Elias Marrow in his younger days tour. Stern, yet with a hint of warmth in his eyes. Around her, the walls were lined with sepia-toned images of the mountain town's past, each frame a piece of the puzzle she was desperate to solve. The mayor's personal effects lay scattered: brittle letters, a worn, leather-bound journal, and a collection of notes scribbled in a tight, deliberate hand. As Clara sifted through the documents, the layers of Elias Marrow's character began to emerge, an intricate tapestry woven with threads of protection and control. Maggie Thornton's guarded insights echoed in her mind. The mayor had been a pillar, a shield for the town against external threats, but that shield came with a price. The secret agreements, the whispered promises, they were more than just pacts. They were chains binding the town in silence. The room's heavy curtains muted the afternoon light, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker like ghosts on the walls. Clara's breath caught as she found a letter addressed to town elders, its tone both commanding and conciliatory, revealing the mayor's delicate balancing act between leadership and manipulation. He spoke of safeguarding traditions and maintaining order, but beneath the surface lay a clear message: obedience was not optional. Later that evening, Clara sought Father James at the small stone church perched on the hill overlooking the town. The priest welcomed her into the quiet sanctuary, the scent of incense mingling with the earthy chill of the mountain air. Rain pattered softly against the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic colors onto the worn pews. Father James's voice was low and steady as he spoke of Elias Marrow's burden, the loneliness of leadership and the moral compromises it demanded. He carried the weight of the town on his shoulders, Father James said, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and respect. But sometimes, the weight bends the bearer in ways no one else sees. Clara nodded, feeling the truth of those words resonate deep within her. Leadership, she realized, was a double-edged sword, capable of protection, yet equally capable of oppression. The next morning brought a confrontation Clara had anticipated, yet dreaded. In the mayor's old study, a room heavy with the scent of polished wood and aged leather, she faced Ellen Marrow. The mayor's estranged daughter was a study in restrained anger, her sharp features softened only by the fatigue etched beneath her eyes. Ellen's voice was brittle as she challenged Clara's assumptions. "You think you can understand him," Ellen said, her gaze piercing, "but you don't see the man behind the mask. He loved this town, yes, but his love came wrapped in secrets and shadows." Their exchange crackled with tension, each word a carefully aimed arrow. Clara felt the weight of Ellen's pain, a legacy of resentment that complicated the straightforward pursuit of truth. It was clear that the mayor's shadow stretched far beyond his absence, casting doubt and discord. Later that day, Clara met with Deputy Sam Collins in the back room of the sheriff's office. The flickering fluorescent light overhead cast long, shifting shadows as Sam hesitated before producing a hidden ledger, its worn cover cracked and edges frayed. The pages detailed transactions, favors, and obligations, ledger of control and influence that Elias Marrow had meticulously maintained. "This is the backbone of his power," Sam muttered, voice low. "Not just the promises, but the debts he kept." Clara's heart quickened as she realized the full extent of the mayor's reach. He had been more than a leader. He was a master of the unspoken rules, weaving a web that ensnared every resident in a delicate balance of fear and loyalty. As the day waned, Clara sat alone once more, surrounded by the relics of a man both protector and manipulator. The unease that had settled in her chest deepened just for the mystery she sought to unravel, but for the town itself, caught in the lingering shadow of Elias Marrow. Her resolve hardened. Uncovering the truth would come at a steep price, but the town deserved no less. And yet, as night fell over the mountain peaks, a question lingered in Clara's mind, echoing through the silence. How could one man bear such a burden without breaking, and at what cost had the town paid for his protection? The mayor's shadow was long, and Clara knew that stepping into it meant confronting not just a vanished leader, but the very soul of the community. The answers lay deeper still, and the journey was far from over. But for now, the room grew colder, the light dimmer, and Clara's thoughts turned to the fragile line between justice and vengeance, a line she would soon have to cross. Clara Hayes stood at the center of the room, her gaze steady despite the swirling tension. Around her, the town's elders, those who had long held the reins of power, sat uneasily, their faces drawn tight with suspicion and unease. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the distant howl of wind rattling the mountain windows. Clara's voice cut through the quiet with measured precision. "I've gathered enough evidence to show that the mayor's hollow promise wasn't just an agreement to protect the town, it was a mechanism of control, manipulation, and betrayal. And those who upheld it did so at a personal cost to their own integrity." Maggie Thornton, seated near the far wall, shifted uncomfortably. Her weathered hands clenched and unclenched, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across her lined face. "I didn't want it to come to this," she murmured, her voice heavy with regret. "But for years, I kept secrets to protect this town, and maybe myself." The room stirred. Deputy Sam Collins, standing with a rigid posture near the entrance, swallowed hard. His loyalty to the town was palpable, but Clara saw the conflict writ large on his face, the battle between duty and truth. "We all made choices," he said quietly, eyes flicking nervously between Clara and the elders. Some harder than others. Ellen Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, stepped forward, her voice sharp and raw. "You speak of choices," she said, voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow, "but what about the betrayal? My father trusted you all. You sacrificed his legacy and ours for your own gain." Clara watched as the room fractured, alliances cracking under the weight of exposed secrets. The mayor's disappearance, once shrouded in mystery, now revealed a web of personal betrayals that had kept the town bound in silence. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the town's carefully constructed facade, exposing the cost of the hollow promise. The elders exchanged glances, some defensive, others resigned. The unease in the room thickened, but Clara felt a grim satisfaction. This confrontation was necessary, a reckoning long overdue. It was the point of no return. As the meeting broke into heated whispers and accusations, Clara took mental notes, her determination hardening. The truth was out, but at what cost? And who, in this tangled web of lies and loyalties, would pay the ultimate price? The night outside deepened, shadows stretching long over the mountain town. Inside, the fragile peace was shattered, and Clara knew the final act of this dark story was fast approaching. The lines of betrayal had been drawn, and no one would emerge unscathed. With a steady breath, Clara prepared for what was to come, understanding that in revealing the layers of deception, she had ignited a fire that could consume them all. The mayor's hollow promise was broken, but the consequences of its undoing were only beginning to unfold. Her eyes scanned the room one last time before stepping into the cold night. The mountain air was sharp and biting, but Clara felt the heat of the battle ahead. The truth was a double-edged sword, and she carried it now, ready to wield it, no matter the cost. Deputy Sam Collins sat alone at his desk, the dim glow of a flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Outside, the mountain town of Eldridge seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in a thick fog that blurred the edges of the world and the lines between right and wrong. Sam's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like the storm raging beyond the walls. For months, he had been caught between loyalty to his hometown and the gnawing truth that the town's leaders, those he had grown up respecting, were keeping secrets that threatened to destroy everything. Clara Hayes, with her relentless questions and piercing gaze, had shaken the fragile calm. She was an outsider, yes, but also a beacon of something the town desperately needed: the truth. His breath hitched as he dialed. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, calm but wary. "Clara, Sam," she said softly. "I was hoping you'd call." The conversation that followed was hushed, a careful dance of words and pauses. Sam revealed what he'd learned about the mayor's closest advisors, the secret meetings held behind closed doors, and the threats whispered in the dark. Each detail chipped away at the veneer of small-town harmony. Later that night, in the low light of the local diner, the two met face to face. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and fried food, but beneath it lay a heavier tension. Clara's eyes searched Sam's face, seeking reassurance amidst the uncertainty. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Sam looked away, hands clenched on the table. "Because I can't live with the lies anymore. Not when what's at stake is this town's soul." Their whispered conversation was interrupted by the creak of the door and a sharp voice. "Sam, you're making a mistake." Maggie Thornton stepped into the booth's shadows, her keen eyes burning with a mixture of fear and fury. "You don't understand what you're risking. The town needs that silence to survive." Sam's jaw tightened. Maybe it needs the truth more. Maggie's expression faltered, the years of guarding secrets weighing down her shoulders. "Think of what you're throwing away." Sam shook his head and rose, the resolve in his stance unmistakable. "I think I've already lost too much." The next morning, Sam stood alone on a rocky overlook, the mountain horizon ablaze with the first light of dawn. The chill air bit at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread settled in his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and betrayal, yet beneath it all, a steady flame of hope flickered. He whispered into the wind, for Eldridge, for the truth. As the sun climbed higher, casting away the night's shadows, Sam knew that his choice would change everything. The town's fragile silence was breaking, and with it, the hollow promise that had bound them all. But would the town survive the reckoning to come? The crossroads of conscience had been reached, and there was no turning back. The rain's relentless tapping mirrored the storm raging inside Sam's mind as he debated the perilous path before him. Every ally turned adversary, every secret revealed, was a step further from the life he knew and closer to an uncertain future. Clara's persistence was a beacon but also a threat to the delicate balance the town had maintained for decades. He thought of Mayor Elias Marrow, the man who had forged the promise that both protected and imprisoned Eldridge. Sam's loyalty had once been unshakable. But the mayor's disappearance had shattered that illusion, exposing a web of control and fear. In the dimly lit diner, Clara's steady voice gave him strength. "We can't let fear dictate the truth, Sam. You're not alone in this." Her words stirred something deep within him, a mixture of hope and dread. Could the town rise above its legacy of silence, or would the broken oaths doom them all? Maggie's confrontation had been a stark reminder of what was at stake. The town's history was woven with secrets, and some were desperate to keep it that way. Yet Sam's conscience refused to let him turn back. Standing at the overlook, the vast mountains stretched before him, majestic yet indifferent. They had witnessed the town's promises and betrayals, the whispered fears and shouted lies. Now, they bore witness to a choice that would define Eldridge's future. Sam exhaled slowly, the cold air steadying his resolve. No more silence, he vowed. The hollow promise was unraveling, and with it, the fragile peace of the mountain town. But in the shadows of betrayal, a new dawn was breaking, uncertain, fragile, but real. And Detective Clara Hayes was ready to face whatever came next. The chapter closes on Sam's solitary figure silhouetted against the rising sun. The mountain breeze carrying the whispers of a town on the edge of transformation. The choices made today would echo through Eldridge's future, challenging the very foundations of trust and power. The crossroads had been reached. The question now was what path the town would take, toward redemption or ruin, and Clara's pursuit of truth had never been more urgent. Detective Clara Hayes stepped inside, her breath visible in the chill that clung to the air, mingling with the faint scent of aged wood and dust. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the paneled walls, each marking the passage of time and the secrets held within. The elders had arrived, one by one, their footsteps muted but laden with the weight of unspoken fears. Clara watched as their faces, etched with the lines of years spent guarding the town's darkest truths, hardened into expressions of cautious defiance. Among them, the spectre of Mayor Elias Marrow hung like a silent judge, his absence a heavy presence that permeated every corner of the room. Clara's hand tightened around the folder she carried, the evidence within a stark testimony to the betrayals and broken oaths that had bound this community in silence. She felt the familiar stirrings of doubt and guilt, shadows of her own past losses echoing in the gravity of the moment. Yet, beneath it all, an iron resolve took hold. This reckoning was necessary, no matter the cost. Maggie Thornton, the town's innkeeper and reluctant historian, leaned in slightly as Clara passed her a glance. There was a flicker of something unspoken in Maggie's weathered, reluctant respect, tempered by fear. The alliance forged between them was fragile but vital, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Deputy Sam Collins stood nearby, shifting uneasily in his worn uniform. His loyalty to the town was palpable, yet his eyes betrayed the conflict raging within. Clara knew his position was precarious, caught between the old guard he had long served and the unsettling truths she was unraveling. His allegiance could tip the balance of the unfolding drama. As Clara cleared her throat and began to speak, the room fell into a heavy silence, her voice steady despite the tremor of tension in the air. Laid bare the evidence of manipulation and betrayal, the hollow promise Mayor Marrow had crafted as a mechanism of control, now unraveling before their eyes. The elders exchanged glances, their carefully constructed facades cracking under the pressure of exposure. Accusations hung thick in the air, mingling with fear and suppressed rage. The town's veneer of unity splintered, revealing the fractured loyalties and buried guilt that had long festered beneath the surface. Clara could feel the room closing in, the consequences of her revelations rippling outward like shockwaves. Questions and denials volleyed back and forth. The elders desperate to maintain their grip on the narrative, even as the truth threatened to topple the fragile order they had maintained. Clara met their resistance with unwavering determination, knowing that this confrontation was a turning point, one that might either shatter the cycle of silence or provoke a backlash that could endanger everything she had fought to uncover. Outside, the mountain wind howled, as if echoing the turmoil within. Clara sensed that the reckoning had only just begun. There were still shadows to confront, allies to find, and dangers to face. But for the first time, the town's secrets were no longer buried beneath layers of fear and silence. They had been dragged into the light. As the meeting drew to a close, Clara gathered her notes with a steady hand, the weight of the moment settling deep in her chest. The elders retreated into whispered conversations, their eyes flickering with a mixture of defiance and doubt. She knew the path ahead would be perilous, that the forces she had disturbed would not relinquish their hold without a fight. But Clara also knew this. The truth was a hollow promise no longer, and she was determined to see it fulfilled, no matter the cost. The door to the town hall shut behind her with a decisive thud, leaving Clara alone in the cold mountain night. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. Her resolve hardened like the frost that glazed the mountain peaks outside. Each breath a silent vow to unearth the buried sins, to challenge the shadows of power, and to bring justice to a town held captive by its own history. The fragile balance had been broken. Now, the real fight for truth and redemption was underway. And somewhere in the darkness, eyes watched, waiting for the next move. Clara Hayes stood at the center, her presence commanding despite the room's oppressive silence. Around her, the town's most influential figures sat stiffly, their faces a mixture of apprehension and guarded defiance. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, every breath heavy with the weight of long-buried secrets. Clara's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Maggie Thornton, whose weathered hands clutched a fragile, yellowed document. "This," Maggie began, her voice quivering, "is the original secret agreement, the hollow promise every resident, every family signed decades ago. It was meant to protect us, to keep the town safe. But it's become a shackle, binding us in silence and fear." The room seemed to shrink as Maggie unfolded the brittle paper, her fingers tracing the faded signatures. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady yet firm. Why keep this hidden? What was Mayor Marrow truly protecting, and at what cost? A murmur rippled through the assembly. Deputy Sam Collins shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting between Clara and the town elders. His allegiance was a fragile thread stretched taut between loyalty to his community and the pursuit of truth. His voice broke the tension as he said, "We all wanted to believe it was for the greater good, but now I'm not so sure." Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, leaned forward, her sharp gaze piercing through the fog of denial. "My father wasn't the savior everyone made him out to be," she declared, her voice laced with bitter resolve. "He used that promise to control us, to manipulate us. The man we mourned has a darker legacy than any of you want to admit." Gasps echoed around the hall, faces pale in the candlelight. Clara seized the moment to press further. If the mayor's promises were hollow, who benefits from keeping them intact? Who is willing to silence dissent to preserve the status quo? Eyes shifted uncomfortably. The fragile veneer of unity cracked, revealing fissures of betrayal and fear. Maggie's voice softened. Some of us did what we thought was necessary, but the cost was higher than we realized. The tension escalated as accusations flew, alliances unraveling like the brittle pages of the document Maggie held. Deputy Collins stood, his expression torn. "I've been caught between my duty and my conscience. It's time we faced the truth, no matter how painful." Clara felt the room's energy shift, the long-suppressed emotions now unleashed. The mayor's absence loomed larger than ever, a shadow that stretched over every confession, every fear. The hollow promise had bound the town in chains of silence, but now those chains were breaking. As the confrontation reached its peak, Clara's mind raced. The stakes had never been higher. Trust was fragile, alliances fickle. The town's future hinged on the choices made in this room. With a steely resolve, Clara concluded, "We can no longer hide behind promises forged in fear. The town deserves the truth, and I intend to see it through no matter the cost." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the distant howl of wind through the mountain pines outside. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The candle flames flickered once more, casting long shadows that danced with the ghosts of the past, as Clara braced herself for the battles yet to come. The heavy wooden floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she leafed through the brittle pages of a ledger she had found hidden behind a loose panel in the mayor's office. The ink was faded, the handwriting meticulous yet cold. It was the original secret agreement, the hollow promise that had bound the townspeople decades ago. Her breath fogged the air as she read aloud softly to herself. "All residents hereby pledge absolute discretion and loyalty to the mayor's governance in exchange for protection and prosperity. Any breach shall be met with communal reprisal." The words were deceptively simple, but Clara could feel the weight behind them. This was no ordinary town pact. It was a tool of psychological control, a mechanism for maintaining power through fear and silence. She leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the margins where annotations hinted at punishments for dissenters, ostracization, economic penalties, even threats of violence. The mayor was not just a leader, he was a puppeteer weaving a web of obligation and intimidation. The revelation sent a cold shiver down Clara's spine. The mayor's disappearance was not just a missing person case. It was the unraveling of a carefully maintained cage. Later that evening, the tension in the town was palpable. Outside the warm Hearth Inn, the air was thick with frost and unspoken accusations. Maggie Thornton, the innkeeper, stood with arms crossed, her weathered face set in a grim expression as she confronted Deputy Sam Collins. "You can't keep playing both sides, Sam," Maggie said, her voice low but firm. "The town deserves better than your silence." Sam shifted uneasily, his uniform creaking as he squared his shoulders. "I'm trying to keep the peace, Maggie. It's more complicated than you think." "Complicated? It's betrayal, plain and simple. You swore to protect this town, not shield its secrets." Their heated exchange cut through the biting wind, drawing curious glances from late-night patrons. Clara watched from a distance, her mind racing. Loyalties were fracturing, alliances shifting, and the fragile order the mayor had enforced was crumbling. The following day brought a somber meeting in the small parlor of the inn. Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, had returned to town, her presence stirring old wounds. Her sharp gaze softened only when she spoke to Clara. "My father was a master at controlling fear," Ellen confessed, voice trembling. "He convinced us all that his silence was protection, but it was a prison. I lived in the shadow of his promises and the secrets that came with them." Tears welled in her eyes as she recounted years of isolation and resentment. Clara reached out, offering what little comfort she could. The shared pain between them bridged the gap between investigator and insider, adding a new layer of urgency to Clara's quest. That night, Clara walked the empty streets beneath a thick blanket of snow. The world was muffled, save for the distant tolling of church bells, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the town's fractured spirit. She breathed in the cold air, feeling the weight of the town's history settle heavily on her shoulders. Every step forward was a step deeper into the moral complexities of leadership and control. The mayor's hollow promise had preserved the town's surface tranquility, but at the price of its soul. Clara knew the path ahead would be treacherous. Exposing the truth meant not only risking the wrath of the town's elders, but also challenging the very foundations of trust that held the community together. The cost of justice was high, but it was a price she was determined to pay. As snowflakes drifted down like silent witnesses, Clara steeled herself for the battles to come. The town's fragile peace was breaking, and beneath the fractures lay the promise of reckoning. The night whispered secrets, and Clara was ready to listen. The flicker of a single candle cast long shadows on the peeling walls, the only light in the oppressive darkness that seemed to mirror the turmoil within her. Each word she read deepened the fissures in her understanding of the mayor, the town, and her own role in this tangled web of promises and betrayals. It was late in no, it was early morning, but sleep had long abandoned her. The journal was a confession and a curse, a revelation that spoke of control masked as protection, of alliances forged in fear rather than trust. Elias Marrow was no mere victim of disappearance. He was an architect of silence, a keeper of secrets whose hollow promise had ensnared an entire community. Her eyes blurred as she closed the journal, pressing her palms to her temples. The weight of what she now knew felt unbearable. To expose the truth would shatter the fragile peace the town clung to, and yet to turn away would betray everything she believed about justice. The line between right and wrong, so clear when she first arrived, had dissolved into a murky grey. The next morning, the mountain town stirred under a pale, hesitant sun. Clara met Deputy Sam Collins at the town square, where the usual quiet was replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Sam's face was drawn, his usual stoic demeanor cracked by worry and frustration. "You need to stop," Sam said quietly, his voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "This investigation, it's tearing the town apart. People are scared, Clara. Scared of what's coming out. Scared of what might happen if you keep pushing." She looked at him, her eyes searching. Scared enough to protect secrets that have poisoned this place for decades. Sam's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple. Those secrets kept the town together. Without them, we're nothing but fractured pieces." "Then maybe it's time to put the pieces back together properly," Clara replied, her voice firm despite the tremor of doubts inside. Their confrontation drew a small crowd, whispers swirling like the chill mountain breeze. The divide between Clara and the town's defenders was more than professional. It was personal. Detective Clara Hayes stood by the window of Maggie Thornton's watching the faint glow of lamplight flicker across the narrow streets. It was too late for most to be wondering, but the unspoken tension in the town kept Clara restless, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Inside the back room, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the faint, lingering aroma of tobacco smoke. Maggie sat across from Clara, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, knuckles white beneath the soft glow of the single hanging bulb. Her eyes, sharp and weary, darted toward the door every so often, as if expecting someone or something to break the fragile quiet. I never thought I'd see the day when the whole town's skeletons were rattling in the open," Maggie said quietly, voice hushed, yet carrying the weight of decades. "We all carried our secrets like stones in our pockets, hoping no one would notice the bulge." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "And now, what happens when the stones fall out?" Maggie's gaze dropped to the floor. "That's the question, isn't it? Some are scared the whole mountain might crumble." Their conversation was interrupted by the low creak of the front door opening, footsteps crunching softly on the gravel outside. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her coat pocket, where her notebook lay waiting. Deputy Sam Collins appeared in the doorway, his uniform rumpled and his face drawn with fatigue and conflict. The cold night air caught his breath, visible in the faint mist that rose with each exhale. "I thought I might find you here," Sam said, voice rough but steady. His eyes met Clara's with a mixture of resolve and hesitation. "There's something you need to hear before it gets any worse." Clara gestured for him to join them, watching as he settled into a chair, the weight of his loyalty to the town and his duty to justice etched across his features. "People are scared," Sam admitted, "not just of what's been uncovered, but what's still buried. They want to protect the town, protect themselves, even if that means keeping the truth locked away." Maggie sighed, a tremor in her voice. "We've been living with this guilt for so long. It's a burden that's eaten at us all, but no one wanted to say it out loud." The room's atmosphere thickened with unsaid confessions and the heavy silence that followed. Later, Clara met with Elias Marrow in the cramped living room of her childhood home, the walls crowded with faded photographs and relics of a life both cherished and rejected. Ellen's sharp features were softened by the flickering firelight, yet the guarded expression she wore was unmistakable. "People think I'm bitter," Ellen began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I am, but it's not just about my father. It's about what he made us all do. The promises, the silence, the lies." Her hands trembled as she clasped a worn locket, a symbol of the family she'd once hoped to reclaim. "I loved him, in my own way," she continued, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I hated the man he became. The man who built this town on secrets and fear." Clara listened, the detective's usual analytical calm giving way to a profound empathy. Here was a woman carrying the weight of a legacy too heavy to bear alone. In the days that followed, Father James gathered a small group in the old stone church, its cold walls echoing with the soft murmur of prayers and the rustling of worn pages. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that danced across faces etched with worry and hope. "We cannot change the past," the priest said gently, "but we can choose how to move forward. Forgiveness is not forgetting, but the courage to face what was and seek a better way." The somber congregation listened, the air thick with the possibility of redemption mingling with the lingering fear of what truths still lay hidden. Back at the inn, Clara sat alone, her notebook open but untouched. The revelations of the past days swirled in her mind, the emotional fractures in the town laid bare like an open wound. She realized that the search for truth was more than a professional pursuit, was a journey into the very heart of human frailty and strength. As the mountain winds howled outside, carrying with them the ghosts of broken promises and buried guilt, Clara steeled herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations. But for tonight, the town's burdened hearts had spoken, and their voices would not be silenced again. The fragile peace was shattered, but from the fragments, something new, something real might begin to take shape. And Clara knew that the path ahead would test every ounce of her resolve. The night deepened, and with it, The shadow of the hollow promise loomed larger than ever, an unyielding reminder that some debts of the heart could never be easily repaid. Yet, amid the darkness, a faint glimmer of hope flickered, fragile but undeniable, promising that even the heaviest burdens might one day be laid down. And with that thought, Clara closed her eyes, bracing herself for the reckoning yet to come. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of aged paper and cedar. She moved cautiously, her flashlight beams sweeping across stacks of forgotten crates, yellowed documents, and a battered leather satchel lying half hidden beneath a threadbare tarp. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the place no one had dared mention until now, whispered about in half-truths and nervous glances. The hidden refuge of Elias Marrow, the vanished mayor whose disappearance had cast a long shadow over the town. Clara knelt beside the satchel and unbuckled it, fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a bundle of folded papers, brittle with age. Among them was a letter, penned in the mayor's meticulous hand, its ink faded but legible. She unfolded it carefully, the words sprawling across the page like a confession and a farewell. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "I write not to justify my actions, but to explain the burden I carried alone. The promise I made was never meant as a chain, but a shield from dangers unseen that threatened to consume this town. I disappeared, not out of cowardice, but necessity." Clara's eyes scanned the letter, absorbing the mayor's candid admission of the secret deals, the compromises made, and the ultimate sacrifice he undertook to protect his people from internal ruin and external threats. The hollow promise, it seemed, was a mechanism of control born not purely of malice, but of desperate stewardship. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps below. She quickly tucked the letter away and descended, heart pounding, to find Ellen Marrow and Deputy Sam Collins waiting in the shadowed basement of the town hall. Ellen's face was drawn tight with unresolved pain. Sam's stance was tense, torn between loyalty and duty. "You found it," Ellen said quietly, her voice a mixture of relief and accusation. "After all these years, the truth finally surfaces. But are you ready for what it means?" Clara met her gaze steadily. "I need to know why he vanished. Why leave everyone in silence?" Sam shifted uncomfortably. He thought the town would implode without him, that the secrets would tear us apart if they were ever exposed. But hiding it only delayed the reckoning. Clara replied, "Now we have a chance to make things right." The conversation spiraled into a heated exchange as buried resentments surfaced. Ellen's bitterness over her father's absence, Sam's fear of losing the fragile order, and Clara's steadfast resolve. It was a moment charged with raw emotion, a crossroads where truth clashed with loyalty. Later, back at the inn, Maggie Thornton approached Clara quietly, pressing a worn photograph into her hand. The image showed Elias Marrow surrounded by the town's founders, all faces etched with hope and determination. Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He carried the weight of us all," she whispered, "and now, so do we." As night cloaked the mountain town in darkness, Clara stood outside the mayor's hidden refuge, the wind whispering through the pines like a mournful song. The revelation of Elias Marrow's fate left her with a bitter clarity. Justice was not always neat or simple, and the cost of truth could be staggering. Yet beneath the unease, there stirred a fragile hope. Perhaps the town could begin to heal, to rebuild trust from the fractured past. But first, they had to confront the hollow promise, and the shadows it had long concealed. Clara's breath fogged in the cold night air as she turned away from the refuge, a quiet determination settling within her. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and moral ambiguity, but she would see it through, no matter the cost. Because some promises, no matter how hollow, demanded reckoning, and some truths refused to stay buried forever. The mountain wind carried a solemn echo as Clara walked back through the silent streets, the weight of the mayor's secret pressing on her like the chill of the night. Somewhere in the heart of the town, the fragile line between justice and vengeance trembled, and she was the one holding the balance. Clara stood near the front, her notes in hand, eyes scanning the room filled with familiar faces, some etched with suspicion, others traced with fatigue. The weight of what she was about to say felt almost physical. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice steady but soft. "I know this isn't easy. What we've uncovered isn't just about one man's disappearance. It's about the promise that held this town together for decades, a promise that was never as pure as it seemed." A murmur rippled through the crowd, like the first gust of wind before a storm. Maggie Thornton sat near the back, her hands clenched tightly on her lap, eyes fixed on Clara with a mixture of hope and dread. Deputy Sam Collins stood just inside the door, his posture rigid, the clash of his loyalty to the town and the truth clear in the tension radiating off him. Clara continued, recounting the mayor's secret agreements, the silence that had bound the residents, and the manipulation that had kept them compliant. She spoke of broken oaths and buried guilt, not laying blame but revealing a collective responsibility. Each word seemed to peel back layers of denial, exposing the rawness beneath. "I know this will be difficult," Clara said finally, "but acknowledging the past is the first step toward healing." After the meeting, the hall emptied slowly. In the dimming light outside, Maggie locked the inn's door, her face shadowed by worry. The town's facade was cracking, and with it came uncertainty. She knew some would resist change fiercely, clinging to old loyalties and fears. Meanwhile, Deputy Sam Collins walked the empty streets, the echoes of Clara's words mixing with the evening chill. The mountains loomed dark and silent, as if listening. His mind wrestled with the choice between protecting the town's secrets and standing with Clara's pursuit of truth. The shadows lengthened, mirroring the cracks forming in his own convictions. At the edge of town, in the quiet sanctuary of the churchyard, Elias Marrow waited. When Clara arrived, the tension between them was palpable. Ellen's eyes were sharp, her voice edged with bitterness as she spoke of her father's legacy, the man who was both protector and oppressor. "You think you've solved it," Ellen said, "but some wounds never heal. The truth is just another kind of burden." Clara met her gaze steadily. "Maybe, but it's a burden we have to bear if we want to move forward." The conversation lingered between them, heavy and unresolved, but beneath the bitterness was a flicker of understanding. The path ahead was uncertain, but the first steps had been taken. As night fell, the mountain town rested uneasily, caught between the past's shadows and the fragile hope of redemption. The hollow promise had been broken, but in its breaking lay the possibility of something new if only they dared to embrace it. And somewhere in the dark, Clara's resolve hardened. The truth had come at a cost, but she was determined to see it through, no matter what lay ahead. Detective Clara Hayes had insisted on this meeting, sensing that the town's only path forward lay in confronting the past together, rather than hiding behind silence and secrets. The air was thick with anticipation as the townspeople filed inside, their faces shadowed by fatigue and the weight of unspoken truths. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the scent of old timber and faint smoke from the hearth mingled with the murmurs that rippled like a restless breeze through the gathered crowd. Clara stood at the front, her posture firm but inviting, her eyes scanning the faces that had become both puzzle and mirror throughout her investigation. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice steady but gentle. "I know this isn't easy. None of it is. But silence has held this town captive for too long. It's time we speak honestly, not just to uncover the truth about Elias, but to find a way to heal." Her words hung in the air, met initially with a guarded silence that spoke volumes. Maggie Thornton, the innkeeper whose stories had slowly bridged gaps in Clara's understanding, stepped forward next. Her weathered hands rested lightly on the edge of the podium, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "I remember when this town was just a handful of families, bound by more than just land and law. We were tied by promises, yes, but also by hope. Tonight, I ask us to remember that hope, even if it's buried beneath pain and mistakes." A murmur of agreement passed through some, while others shifted uneasily. The room's atmosphere felt suspended between the past and an uncertain future. Elias Marrow entered the circle of light, her presence commanding yet fragile. The mayor's estranged daughter had returned after years away, her sharp gaze softening as she addressed the crowd. "I've lived with the shadow of my father's legacy," she said, voice trembling but clear. "Pain, resentment, but also a deep need to understand. To be understood. We all carry scars from what's been done and left undone. Maybe it's time we stop running from them." Her words sparked a ripple of emotion, some nodding in acknowledgement, others wiping away tears. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a fracture in the wall of silence that had long shielded the town's darker truths. Deputy Sam Collins, ever the pragmatist caught between loyalty and conscience, spoke quietly but with newfound resolve. "This town isn't perfect," he admitted, "but we have a chance now to choose what we become next. Not ruled by fear or broken promises, but by honesty and trust." Father James, the town's spiritual anchor, closed the meeting with a prayer that honored both the pain and the possibility of forgiveness. His gentle voice wove a thread of compassion through the room, leaving an echo of peace amid the lingering tension. As the crowd dispersed, Clara lingered by the door, watching faces no longer just fearful or guarded, but touched by a fragile hope. Outside, the mountain sky stretched wide and cold, stars blinking silently overhead. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the echoes of a long-held promise now unraveling. Alone in the biting cold, Clara pulled her jacket tighter around her and looked back toward the glowing windows of the hall. The town's journey toward redemption was only beginning. And though the path was uncertain, the first steps had been taken. With each breath, she felt the weight of their shared past, but also the stirring possibility of a future rewritten not by secrets, but by courage and truth. The night was far from over, and Clara knew the days ahead would test every resolve. Yet, as the mountain wind carried away the shadows, a quiet determination settled within her. The echoes of redemption were faint but unmistakable, and she would see them through, no matter the cost. The fragile promise of a new dawn lingered on the horizon, waiting for those brave enough to reach for it. Clara stood near the hearth, her notes folded neatly in her hands, but her attention fully on the circle of faces gathered before her. Each held the weight of years spent in quiet denial, the scars of broken promises etched faintly beneath their weary gazes. "We can't keep going like this," Clara said softly, her voice threading through the room with a mix of resolve and empathy. "The town has been held hostage by secrets and silence for too long. It's time we start talking honestly about what happened, about what we allowed, and about what we want moving forward. Maggie shifted in her chair, the glow of the firelight catching the lines worn deep by decades of both joy and hardship. "It's not easy," she murmured, her eyes steady on Clara. "People here, they're scared. Not just of what's out there, but of what's inside." Clara nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The fear wasn't just about the vanished mayor or the hidden agreements. It was about facing the fractures within themselves and their community. Elias Marrow stood apart by the window, her silhouette framed by the grey drizzle that tapped gently against the glass. Her arms were crossed tightly, but her voice softened as she began to speak. "My father was a man of contradictions, protector to some, tyrant to others. I've wrestled with that my whole life. But I came back because this town is my home, no matter how broken it is." The room fell silent, the rain's rhythm underscoring the gravity of her confession. Clara saw the vulnerability beneath Ellen's guarded exterior, a reflection of her own struggles with loss and trust. Deputy Sam Collins, usually the pillar of local order, sat with a tension Clara hadn't seen before. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest, then stilled as he finally spoke, voice low and raw. "I've been loyal to the town, and to the mayor's vision. But I can't pretend anymore that silence was the answer. I've made mistakes, turning a blind eye, letting fear dictate my actions. It's time to own that." There was a collective intake of breath, the admission breaking through a barrier too long fortified by pride and denial. Father James, seated quietly at the edge of the room, stood and moved toward the small altar adorned with a single candle. He lit it with deliberate care, the flame flickering to life and casting a warm glow that seemed to hold the promise of renewal. "Forgiveness," he intoned gently, "isn't forgetting the past, but choosing to move beyond it. This town has the strength to heal if it dares to embrace that truth." The words hung in the air, mingling with the scent of smoke and rain. A fragile bridge between what was lost and what could be reclaimed. As the evening wore on, voices rose and fell, stories spilled forth, some bitter, some hopeful. Clara listened, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and apprehension. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, the town was no longer bound by silence. Outside, the mountain winds whispered through the trees, carrying away fragments of the past and beckoning toward a future forged from courage and honesty. Clara stayed late into the night, scribbling notes not just of facts, but of feelings and promises, tentative, fragile, but real. As she closed her notebook, a knock sounded softly at the door. She opened it to find Ellen, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing there's a way forward." Clara smiled, the quiet hope between them a small but vital flame amidst the shadows. "We'll find it together." The chapter closed on that fragile note, the mountain town stirring from its long slumber, poised at the cusp of healing but aware that some fractures ran deep. The promise now lay in the hands of those brave enough to face the past and build anew. And somewhere in the silence beyond the hills, the echoes of broken oaths began to fade, replaced by the tentative murmur of trust reborn, delicate but unyielding. As the wooden chairs creaked and shifted, the room filled with the faces of a community torn old and young, allies and skeptics each, carrying the weight of the mayor's absence in their own way. Clara Hayes stood near the back, her arms folded against the chill that seemed to seep from the mountain walls, watching as the meeting began to spiral into something far more volatile than she had anticipated. Mayor Elias Marrow's disappearance had unearthed not only secrets, but also a fault line running deep through the town's generations. The elders, many of whom had known Elias for decades, clung to memories steeped in loyalty and perhaps a touch of denial. They spoke of the mayor's vision, his unyielding commitment to the mountain town's safety, even if it came at a cost. Across the room, the younger residents, some barely out of their teens, challenged these views with a fervor born of frustration and a desire for transparency. To them, the hollow promise was no longer a protective pact, but a chain binding them to a past they wished to break free from. Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter, took the floor with a calm that belied the storm of emotions beneath. Her voice, steady yet edged with bitterness, cut through the din. "We can't keep living in the shadow of secrets and silence," she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "My father's legacy isn't just a story to be told, it's a burden that's been passed down, and it's time we decide what kind of town we want to be." A murmur rippled through the hall. Some nodded in agreement. Others bristled. An older man, his face lined by years of mountain winters, stood to counter. "Ellen, with all due respect, you left this town when you were young. You don't understand the sacrifices made to keep us safe. These promises, hollow or not, were our shield." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some accusing, others defending, all steeped in pain and unresolved anger. Clara felt the weight of it pressing in on her, the impossible task of untangling truth from loyalty, guilt from fear. Outside, the mountain air was crisp and biting. Maggie Thornton leaned against the rough-hewn frame of the building, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky. Deputy Sam Collins stood nearby, his uniform rumpled, his face betraying exhaustion. "It's getting worse," Maggie murmured, her voice low. "The town's unraveling." Sam nodded slowly. "And Clara, she's caught in the middle." "She always does," Maggie said, a sad smile touching her lips. "But she's the only one who might just make a difference." Back inside, Clara stepped forward as the meeting drew to a close, raising her voice to be heard over the lingering murmur. "This town has been held together by a fragile thread of promises and fears," she said, meeting the eyes of those around her. "If we don't face what's broken, that thread will snap. We need honesty, even if it's painful." Her words hung in the air, met with silence first, then hesitant nods. The crowd began to disperse, but the unease remained a shared acknowledgement that the road ahead would be difficult, that the town stood divided and vulnerable. Clara lingered by the doorway, her gaze drifting over the mountain silhouette against the twilight sky. The promise of a new dawn felt distant, fragile, yet beneath the cracks and fractures, she sensed a cautious hope, a possibility that through confrontation and courage, the town might heal. As the last stragglers vanished into the dark streets, Clara's thoughts circled back to the hollow promise, to the secrets buried beneath layers of time and silence. The investigation was far from over. The mountain town's future rested on the fragile balance between past and change, trust and betrayal, and on whether one determined detective could navigate the dangerous divide and bring light to the shadows. And somewhere, deep in the night, the mountains seemed to hold their breath, waiting. The meeting had shown Clara clearly that truth alone would not be enough. The scars of the past were etched, not just in documents or whispered confessions, but in the hearts of every resident. To solve the mystery of Mayor Elias Marrow's disappearance, she would have to become more than an outsider with questions. She would need to become a bridge, fragile but necessary, over a chasm that threatened to swallow the town whole. The night stretched on, cold and silent, but Clara's resolve burned brighter than ever. The town was divided, but she would not let it fall apart. Not yet. With a final glance at the stars piercing the mountain darkness, she turned away and walked down the empty street, the hollow promise echoing in her mind like a warning and a challenge. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky with streaks of amber and purple, and the first stars began to prick the twilight. Here, away from the hum of the investigation's frenetic pace, Clara allowed herself a moment to breathe and think. The quiet was a stark contrast to the storm of revelations and emotions that had marked the past weeks. She traced the outline of the distant peaks with her eyes and reflected on everything she had uncovered. The mayor's disappearance had been a catalyst, but what she had unearthed was far more intricate layers of broken oaths, a community bound by fear and silence, and the fragile threads of trust stretched thin. Justice, she realized, was not as simple as right and wrong. It was tangled with moral ambiguity and the shadows of human frailty. Her mind drifted to the faces she'd encountered: Maggie Thornton, whose warmth was guarded behind years of loyalty and fear; Father James, whose quiet strength and wisdom had provided solace; and Deputy Sam Collins, caught between duty and allegiance. Each person carried their own burden, shaped by the mayor's hollow promise and its aftermath. Later that evening, Clara found herself inside the familiar warmth of Maggie's inn. The hearth crackled, casting flickering light on the worn wooden beams and the faded photographs that decorated the walls. Maggie poured 2 cups of tea, setting one gently before Clara. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Maggie spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "The town's been through hell," Maggie said, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance to start mending what's been broken. It won't be easy, and the scars run deep, but the silence is breaking." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "It's a fragile hope," she admitted, "but hope is something we need to hold on to." Their conversation lingered on the complexities of forgiveness and the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust. Maggie's cautious optimism was a balm to Clara's weary spirit. The following day, Clara visited the local church. The quiet sanctuary was cool and dim, the faint scent of incense mingling with the wood and stone. Father James greeted her with a gentle smile, his presence steady and grounding. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth comes wrapped in pain, and justice is not a clean line but a winding path. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means understanding the wounds that bind us and choosing to move forward despite them." Clara absorbed his words, feeling a measure of peace settle within her. The investigation had changed, who opened her eyes to the murky shades between right and wrong. She was no longer the rookie detective who believed in clear-cut answers. Instead, she embraced the complexity of human nature and the necessity of compassion alongside accountability. Outside, the town stirred with subtle shifts. Deputy Sam Collins sat in his patrol car, watching the main street bathed in morning light. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of tension and contemplation. The revelations had shaken the town's foundation, and loyalties were being tested as old alliances frayed. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a tentative movement toward change was beginning. Clara knew the road ahead was uncertain. The broken promises and buried guilt would not vanish overnight. But in this fragile moment, she saw the possibility of a new beginning for the town and for herself. As she packed her belongings, preparing for the journey back to the city, Clara felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. The case was closed, but the lessons lingered, shaping her understanding of justice and humanity. She took one last look at the mountain peaks silhouetted against the dawn, a symbol of endurance and change. With a deep breath, Clara stepped into the future, ready to carry the weight of the past with wisdom and hope. But the shadows of the hollow promise still whispered beneath the surface, reminding her that some secrets never fully fade and some journeys never truly end. And as the town awoke beneath the rising sun, the fragile crossroads awaited. Poised between the lingering shadows of yesterday and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. The path forward was uncertain, but Clara was determined to walk it with eyes wide open, carrying the truth she had uncovered as both a burden and a beacon. The mountain town, scarred but unbroken, would have to find its own way through the darkness, and so would she. Detective Clara Hayes stood alone on the rocky overlook, the crisp air biting at her cheeks as she gazed down at the town she had come to know so intimately. The streets, still quiet in the pre-dawn hush, seemed to pulse with the echoes of the secrets she had unraveled, secrets that had bound the community in silence for decades. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she wrapped her jacket tighter around her. The weight of the investigation, the faces she had met, the fractured loyalties and broken promises, they all seemed to settle inside her like a heavy stone. Yet beneath that weight was a strange sense of peace. The mystery was no longer a shadow hanging over the town. It had been faced, exposed, and confronted. Turning away from the view, Clara made her way back down the narrow path toward the heart of the town. The inn, warm and inviting, was already stirring with life. Inside, Maggie Thornton was tending the hearth, her weathered hands folding a blanket over a chair as she prepared for the day. "Morning, Detective," Maggie said with a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Leaving so soon?" Clara nodded, her fingers trailing over the worn wood of the doorframe. "I have to, but before I go, I wanted to thank you for everything." Maggie's expression softened, though a guarded sadness lingered beneath her warmth. "This town isn't easy to understand, but you gave it a chance." They shared a quiet moment, the unspoken words heavy between them. Clara knew the road ahead for the town was uncertain. The fragile truce they now lived under could shatter at any moment. But for the first time, there was a flicker of hope. Outside, Deputy Sam Collins waited by the sheriff's office, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. His weather-beaten uniform seemed heavier today, burdened by the choices he had made. As Clara approached, their eyes met an unspoken understanding passing between them. "I never thought I'd say it, but good luck, Clara," Sam said, his voice rough but sincere. "Thanks, Sam. Take care of the town." Their handshake was firm, a final bridge between two worlds, the investigator from the city and the loyal son of the mountains. Later, Clara found herself at the church, where Ellen Marrow stood quietly with Father James. The estranged daughter of the vanished mayor looked out the stained glass windows, her fingers nervously twisting a rosary. "It's not easy facing the past," Father James said softly, his presence steady as the ancient stones around them. Ellen nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "But maybe it's the only way forward." Clara watched from the doorway, feeling the fragile threads of reconciliation weaving through the room. The town's future was still uncertain, but the first steps toward healing were being taken. As the sun climbed higher, Clara packed the last of her belongings into her worn duffel bag. Each item carried memories, the notes, the photos, the small trinkets that marked the days spent chasing shadows and uncovering truths. Stepping outside, she took one last look at the mountain town, its peaks bathed in golden light. The hollow promise that had once held it captive was broken, but its echoes would linger, shaping the lives of those who remained. Clara turned away, her footsteps steady on the winding road. The mountains whispered their farewell, and with them, a chapter of her life closed. Ahead lay new mysteries, new challenges, and the enduring quest for justice. But the lessons of this place, the cost of secrets, the burden of guilt, and the fragile hope for redemption would remain with her forever. As the road stretched out before her, Clara felt the weight of the mountains behind her and the promise of the unknown ahead. The journey was far from over, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve took root. She would carry the mountain town story with her away. The hum of the engine was a steady companion as Clara drove away from the town, the winding roads snaking through the dense forest. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, mingling with the distant call of a lone hawk. Each mile put distance between her and the place that had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her mind replayed the faces she'd come to loathe, guarded glances, the whispered confessions, the moments of raw vulnerability. Maggie's quiet strength, Sam's conflicted loyalty, Ellen's fierce pain, Father James's gentle guidance. They were more than characters in a case. They were the living heartbeat of a community struggling to breathe freely again. Clara's thoughts drifted to the Mayor Elias Marrow, the man who had cast such a long shadow over the town. Protector, manipulator, leader, and prisoner of his own promises. His disappearance had been the catalyst, but it was the people's courage to face the truth that had begun to unravel the hollow promise. She glanced at the small journal tucked in her bag, the mayor's own words, raw and unfiltered. It was a reminder that behind every secret lay a human story, complicated and imperfect. As the mountains faded into the distance, Clara felt a stirring within her unshakable determination to carry forward the lessons she had learned. The search for truth was rarely clean or simple. It was tangled with shades of grey, with choices that left no one untouched. Her phone buzzed softly, breaking the silence. A message from her mentor back in the city, checking in. Clara paused, fingers hovering over the screen before replying. She was no longer the uncertain rookie who had arrived in the mountain town. She was a detective tempered by experience, shaped by a community's pain and resilience. The road ahead was long, but Clara was ready. Whatever mysteries awaited, she would face them with the same sharp intuition, empathy, and resolve that had guided her through the mountains. And though she was leaving the town behind, a part of it would always remain with her etched into her soul, like the winding paths she had walked, the broken oaths she had mended, and the fragile promise of a new dawn. The mountains whispered her farewell, but Clara's journey was just beginning. Evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the worn floorboards where generations had gathered before. Tonight, it held the town's fragile future in its walls. Clara Hayes stood near the back, her posture cautious but steady. Around her, faces from every corner of the mountain town, some etched with weariness, others with guarded hope, turned toward Maggie Thornton, who spoke with a calm strength that belied the tremor in her voice. Maggie's hands rested lightly on the polished oak podium, knuckles white from the effort of steadying herself. "We've lived under the weight of a promise," she said, her voice carrying the echoes of decades. A promise made in shadows, sealed by silence. And now, that silence has been broken. Not by choice, but by necessity. Her gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of old friends and rivals alike. The hollow promise Mayor Marrow forged was meant to protect us, to keep our town safe from what lay beyond these mountains. But safety built on secrets is a brittle thing. It fractures, and when it does, it wounds us all. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in reluctant agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Clara observed, feeling the tension coil and release like breath held too long. Deputy Sam Collins, standing off to the side, glanced down before stepping forward, his uniform creased and dusted from months of wear. "I've been torn between loyalty to this town and the duty I swore to uphold," he admitted, voice rough but sincere. "I've made mistakes, Civ. Let fear guide me when I should have stood firm. But I'm here now, ready to face what's come and serve with honesty." The room was quiet again, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Clara sensed the significance not just a man admitting fault, but a turning point for a community long bound by unspoken fears. Elias Marrow, standing near the window with arms crossed, watched the interchange carefully. Her presence was a reminder of the personal costs hidden beneath the political facade. When the meeting adjourned, she approached Clara quietly. "It's not just about what was promised," she said, voice low, "but what we're willing to build from the ashes." Clara nodded, feeling the truth of those words settled deep. The scars left by broken oaths would not fade easily. The mayor's disappearance had torn open wounds that now demanded attention, reckoning, and perhaps redemption. Outside, the mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. The fading light painted the peaks in hues of purple and gold, a silent witness to the town's tentative steps toward healing. Clara lingered for a moment, looking back at the warm glow spilling from the hall's windows, light in the darkness, fragile but fierce. The promise of a new dawn was there, but so too was the long night ahead. As the last of the townsfolk dispersed, Maggie pulled Clara aside. "You've stirred something here," she said softly. "Something this town needed, even if it didn't know it." Clara smiled faintly, the weight of exhaustion pressing down but tempered by a spark of hope. "The truth always comes at a cost," she replied. "But maybe this time it can also be the price of freedom." The legacy of the hollow promise was far from over. But in that moment, beneath the shadowed peaks, the first threads of trust began to weave anew, fragile yet unyielding. Clara knew the road ahead would be long, marked by doubt and struggle, but also by the possibility of renewal. And as the stars began to pierce the twilight sky, she felt the quiet stirrings of a future still unwritten, waiting for those brave enough to claim it. The mountain town stood at a crossroads, poised between the ghosts of its past and the promise of dawn. The question was no longer whether the past would define them, but whether they could choose to rise beyond it. Clara turned away from the hall, her heart heavy but resolute. The investigation had changed her, carved new depths in her understanding of justice and humanity. But the story was not hers. Alone it belonged to every soul bound by the hollow promise. And now, it was time to face what came next. With one last glance at the fading light, Clara stepped forward into the night, carrying the weight of legacy and hope alike. The mountain whispered its secrets around her, but she was ready to listen and to fight for the fragile light breaking through the darkness. Clara Hayes stood on the porch of the inn, her breath misting in the cold evening air as the sun slipped behind the jagged peaks. The sky was awash of deepening blues and purples, the last light stretching long shadows across the empty streets. Despite the calm, Clara felt an oppressive weight pressing down not from the chill, but from the silence itself. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Inside the warm glow of the inn, Maggie Thornton sat behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The familiar scent of worn wood and herbs filled the room, yet Maggie's usual warmth was tempered by a shadow of sorrow. She spoke softly, recounting tales of the town's history, of promises made and broken, her voice trembling with the burden of memories best left unspoken. Clara listened intently, the lines of Maggie's face deepening as the weight of years pressed upon her. There was a weariness in her eyes, a guardedness that spoke of fear and fierce loyalty intertwined. Outside, the sheriff's office cast a long shadow over the cracked pavement. Deputy Sam Collins paced with heavy steps, the creak of the swinging sign above echoing his inner turmoil. His face was taut with exhaustion and conflict caught between the duty he owed to the town and the uncomfortable truths Clara's investigation was unraveling. Every glance over his shoulder betrayed his struggle. The loyalty to the elders who had shaped him, clashing with the growing realization that the town's foundation was built on unstable ground. Further down the main street, Elias Marrow walked alone. The cold air made her breath visible in short bursts as she passed the shuttered windows and faded signs of the town's old businesses. Her steps slowed before the mayor's office, a place heavy with history and unspoken regrets. Her eyes, sharp and intense, flickered with a painful mixture of resentment and hesitant hope. She was caught between the legacy her father left and the desire to forge a new path, her presence a silent challenge to the fragile peace that held the town together. Clara's mind churned as she absorbed the scenes before her, the quiet infilled with muted stories. The restless deputy wrestling with loyalty, the estranged daughter confronting a legacy of shadows. The calm was deceptive. Beneath it simmered tensions that threatened to explode. The hollow promise that had bound the town was fraying, and the cost of its unraveling was still unknown. That night, Clara sat alone in her room at the inn, the flickering candle casting dancing shadows on the walls. She spread her notes across the table, piecing together fragments of whispered conversations and half-truths. The picture emerging was complex and painful layers of guilt, fear, and fractured trust. Yet despite the clarity, a gnawing doubt crept in. Was the town ready to face its past? Could she steer them toward truth without shattering what little peace remained? The mountain winds howled softly outside, carrying with them the scent of pine and the distant rumble of shifting stones. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the investigation pressing down like the night itself. The quiet was only the calm before the storm, and she knew that when it came, nothing would remain the same. As dawn approached, the first pale light crept over the peaks, illuminating the town's sleeping faces. But beneath the surface, unseen eyes watched, and whispered words carried on the wind. The hollow promise was not yet broken, and the secrets it held were far from buried. Clara's journey was far from over, and the mountain town stood at the edge of a precipice, teetering between redemption and ruin. With each passing moment, the uneasy silence deepened, and Clara braced herself for the reckoning that waited just beyond the horizon. The quiet before the storm was a fragile thing, beautiful, deadly, and full of unspoken truths. And when the storm finally broke, it would sweep away everything in its path, leaving the town forever changed. The low light cast long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards, and the faint scent of aged pine mingled with the earthy aroma of old paper. Maggie had insisted Clara join her in the back room, a space rarely used except for storage and the occasional confidential conversation. Maggie moved with a careful purpose, her weathered hands pulling a battered cardboard box from beneath a loose floorboard. "These have been hidden away too long," she murmured, setting the box on the table. Inside, the contents were a treasure trove of the town's forgotten past. Yellowed letters, brittle photographs, and fragile journals that whispered secrets from decades gone by. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the topmost letter, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was elegant, a stark contrast to the rough edges of the paper. It was a letter from one of the town's earliest residents, addressed to Mayor Elias Marrow, expressing concern and hope about the pact that had bound the community together. "It's like the town's soul is trapped in these pages," Clara said softly, eyes scanning the words that spoke of promise, fear, and a desperate longing for protection. Maggie nodded, her keen eyes moistening. "Most folks don't want to remember. Too painful, too complicated. But these letters, they tell the truth no one dared to say aloud." Later that afternoon, Clara found herself descending the narrow stone steps into the church basement, guided by Father James. The air was cooler down here, thick with the scent of dust and candle wax. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with ancient records, faded photographs, and journals so old the bindings cracked at the slightest touch. Father James moved with a solemn grace, retrieving a hefty leather-bound volume. "This is the parish record from the time the mayor first took office," he explained. "It holds more than just births and deaths. There are confessions, not always spoken aloud, but recorded in the margins." Clara flipped through the pages, her heart heavy as she read the annotations, fragments of guilt, pleas for forgiveness, and veiled references to the mayor's influence. The town's history was not the simple, orderly narrative it had appeared to be. It was tangled and fraught with secrets. The evening brought with it a storm, the rain hammering against the window panes, as Clara met Ellen Marrow beneath the flickering glow of a street. Ellen's face was pale, her eyes sharp yet haunted. "You think you know him," Ellen said, voice trembling, "but there are parts of my father you can't understand, parts he buried deep to protect himself and this town." She pulled a folded envelope from her coat pocket, pressing it into Clara's hand. Inside was a letter, written in her father's hand, admitting to decisions made in shadows, choices that sacrificed individuals for the so-called greater good. "I never wanted to believe," Ellen whispered, "but the truth is heavier than any promise." The next morning, Clara visited Jonas Reed's garage. The space was cluttered with car parts and tools, the air thick with the scent of motor oil. Jonas wiped his hands on a rag, leaning against a workbench as he recounted a story he had overheard years ago, a whispered conversation between the mayor and one of the town elders, speaking in coded language about the price of peace. "At the time, I thought it was just politics," Jonas said quietly. "But now, knowing what I do, it makes sense why so many are afraid to speak." These pieces, scattered and fragile, began to form a mosaic of the town's hidden wounds. Clara felt the weight of every story, every silence, pressing upon her. The mayor's pact was more than a simple agreement, it was a web of human frailty, fear, and survival. As night settled over the mountain town, Clara sat alone in her modest room. The collected letters and notes spread before her like a map of buried truths. The whispers of the past were no longer faint murmurs. They were a chorus demanding to be heard. What had once seemed like a straightforward disappearance was unraveling into a complex tapestry of broken promises and concealed pain. Clara knew that with every secret uncovered, the fragile peace of the town teetered closer to collapse. Yet, within those fragile pages lay the key not only to the mayor's disappearance, but to the possibility of healing the wounds that had festered in silence for far too long. The past was finally speaking, and Clara was listening, ready to follow its echoes wherever they might lead. But as the rain tapped against the window, a shadow moved just beyond the glow of the streetlight. Watching, waiting, the town's secrets were restless, and so too were those who would do anything to keep them buried. The town below lay quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on you, making every creak of a signpost or rustle of leaves feel like a whispered warning. Clara's breath puffed in small clouds, mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth. She paused, eyes scanning the dimming streets, searching for something she couldn't yet name, since the mayor's disappearance had officially been declared a closed case. The town seemed to have exhaled collectively, as if relieved. But Clara's instincts, honed through years of chasing shadows, told her the calm was fragile, an uneasy truce rather than peace. The promises that had once bound this community had cracked, but the fractures beneath still throbbed with unseen menace. That evening, inside the warmly lit hearth of Maggie Thornton's inn, Clara found the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Maggie sat behind the worn bar, her sharp eyes flickering toward the door every few moments as if expecting someone or something. The flicker of firelight cast long shadows against the wooden beams, the scent of burning wood mingling with old leather and whispered secrets. "You feel it too," Maggie said quietly, pouring coffee into chipped mugs, like the town's holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to fall. Clara nodded, swirling the dark liquid absently. "The mayor's gone, but the threads he wove haven't unraveled. They're just hidden under the surface." Maggie's gaze hardened, and some folks want to keep it that way. The next day at the police station, Clara caught Deputy Sam Collins hesitating before locking his desk drawer. His usual pragmatic demeanor was tainted with a flicker of apprehension. When their eyes met, the guarded man she'd come to know as both ally and obstacle gave a subtle, conflicted nod. "This town, it doesn't forgive easily," Sam muttered, "and some wounds run deeper than you realize." Clara pressed, but Sam only shook his head, the weight of his divided loyalties clear. He was caught between protecting the town's fragile order and facing the truth she was determined to uncover. Later, standing on a rocky overlook where the cold wind bit at her cheeks, Clara met Elias Marrow, the mayor's estranged daughter. Ellen's intense gaze was shadowed by years of resentment and grief. Her breath formed small clouds in the chill air as she leaned close, voice barely above a whisper. "You think it's over," Ellen said, "but the darkness that swallowed my father, it's still here, watching, waiting." Clara felt the weight of those words settle deep in her bones. The mountain town story was far from finished. Beneath the veneer of resolution lurked threats unseen, ready to rise with the coming storm. As night deepened, Clara walked back through the town's empty streets, the echoes of footsteps behind her making her quicken her pace. The shadows seemed to lean closer, and the whispering wind carried a warning she could no longer ignore. The hollow promise had left scars, and some wounds were not meant to heal quietly. Her investigation had peeled back many layers, but the final truths remained elusive. What unseen enemies still lurked, waiting for their moment? And how many more would be caught in the fallout? Clara's eyes lifted to the star-speckled sky. The mountain town was at a precipice, and the next move could tip everything into chaos. She was no stranger to danger, but this time, the threat felt personally, invisible hand reaching out from the shadows, ready to strike. The silence had been broken, but the real storm was just beginning. The air was thin here, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and it carried a silence far heavier than mere absence of sound. She breathed deeply, eyes tracing the jagged peaks that hemmed in the settlement, a place that had seemed so alive with whispered secrets just days before. Now, with the mayor gone and the hollow promise laid bare, the town felt more like a fragile relic, teetering on the brink of collapse. Clara's gaze drifted over the clustered rooftops, the flicker of candlelight in windows like distant stars clinging to the dark. The weight of Elias Marrow's absence pressed down on her in a way that was almost physical. She had come to understand him as a man caught between protector and manipulator, a leader whose vision for the town had been as much a cage as a sanctuary. His pact, signed in shadow and sealed with silence, had bound the residents tightly, but at what cost? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Father James approaching, his coat pulled tight against the cold. The priest's face was lined, his eyes reflecting the quiet torment of one who carried burdens unseen. "It's a hard night to be thinking," he said quietly, joining her at the ridge's edge. "Hard days too," Clara replied, her voice low. "I've been trying to reconcile who Elias Marrow really was. The mayor everyone feared, yet some still seemed to trust." Father James nodded, folding his hands. "Leadership here has always been a test of faith, not just in God, but in each other. Elias believed he could keep us safe, even if it meant walking a dark path." Clara looked at him, searching for certainty. But was it protection or control? The priest sighed, eyes distant. Sometimes the line blurs. When you're holding the reins, the temptation to tighten your grip grows. You think you're shielding your people, but you may be binding their hands instead. Their conversation lingered in the air as they descended toward the town, the weight of unspoken truths settling between them like a fog. Later, inside the warmth of Maggie Thornton's inn, the crackle of the hearth filled the room with a comforting glow. Maggie sat across from Clara, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her weathered face bore the marks of years spent guarding stories she wished she could forget. "Elias wasn't always the man he became," Maggie began, voice soft but firm. "When he first arrived, he was full of hope and fire. He promised safety, prosperity. We believed him because we had no other choice." Clara leaned in, sensing the tremor beneath Maggie's words. When did it change? When the promises turned to threats, when silence became the currency of survival. We all paid the price for his vision. The firelight danced in Maggie's eyes, reflecting both pain and a lingering loyalty. "I don't hate him, not completely. He was a flawed man, trying to hold together a fragile community. But his methods, they left scars." Clara felt the complexity of the woman's feelings, a mixture of reverence, regret, and resignation. It mirrored the town itself, a place caught between past sins and the hope for redemption. That night, back in her sparse room, Clara sat at the small desk, the mayor's final letters spread before her. The storm outside thrashed against the windows, rain tapping like whispered accusations. Each page revealed fragments of Elias's thoughts, his fears, the burdens of leadership, and his own doubts about the pact he had forged. "I did what I thought was necessary," one letter read. "But the line between protector and tyrant is thinner than I feared. If my disappearance frees the town, perhaps it is worth the pain I leave behind." Clara's fingers trembled as she folded the letter, the words echoing in her mind. Elias Marrow had been a man wrestling with ghosts of his own making, trapped by the very promises he had used to bind others. His legacy was not one of simple villainy or heroism, but a tangled web of intent and consequence. She closed her eyes, the storm's fury outside matching the turmoil within. The mayor's shadow still loomed large, a reminder that the true cost of leadership was often paid in silence and sacrifice. As dawn approached, Clara resolved that understanding this weight was crucial not just for the town's future, but for her own. The path ahead would demand confronting uncomfortable truths and navigating the moral grey that defined Elias Marrow's reign. The question was no longer what the mayor had done, but what she was willing to do in response. Outside, the first light touched the mountain peaks, promising a new day but no easy answers. The hollow promise was a legacy not easily shed, and Clara knew the reckoning was only just beginning. Outside the weathered facade of the town hall, Detective Clara Hayes took a deep breath, steadying herself against the chill and the weight of what lay ahead. The disappearance of Mayor Elias Marrow had fractured this community in ways no outsider could easily mend. But today felt differenter, small shift in the collective atmosphere, as if the long-held silence was beginning to crack. Residents gathered tentatively, their faces etched with a mixture of relief, suspicion, and exhaustion. Clara noticed how even the youngest in the crowd spoke in hushed tones, careful not to rattle the fragile peace. She caught Maggie Thornton's eye across the square. The innkeeper's usual guarded expression softened into a tentative smile. This meeting was Clara's idea, a chance to break the wall of fear and secrecy that had suffocated the town for decades. Inside the hall, the wooden floorboards creaked softly underfoot, and the scent of aged paper mingled with faint traces of pine resin from the old beams overhead. Clara moved to the front, her notes neatly arranged but secondary to the words she would speak. The room was packed with townsfolk, some reluctant, others eager to confront their shared past. "This town has carried a heavy burden," Clara began, her voice calm but resolute. "For too long, secrets have shaped our lives, and silence has been our shield. But shields break. The time has come for us to face what binds us not with anger or blame, but with honesty." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, eyes meeting eyes, some avoiding, others searching for connection. Deputy Sam Collins stepped forward, his usually stoic face betraying a flicker of vulnerability. "We all want what's best for this town," he said slowly. "Maybe it's time we find that together, instead of hiding behind old promises and fears." The conversation that followed was far from easy. Voices rose, memories surfaced, and old wounds ached anew. Yet beneath the tension, Clara sensed a fragile thread weaving through the room, a shared desire to heal. Later, Clara found herself in the warm, flickering light of Maggie's inn. The contrast with the cold mountain air outside was stark. The crackling hearth casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with relics of the town's past. Maggie poured 2 mugs of steaming tea, her hands steady despite the storm of emotion she carried. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Maggie said softly, sliding a mug across the worn counter. "But maybe that's what we needed." Clara accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "It's not just about finding answers," Clara replied. "It's about giving people a chance to trust, again to believe that the truth, however painful, can set us free." Maggie nodded, eyes reflecting years of hardship and hope. "This town's got scars, but it's got heart too." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows as Deputy Sam Collins lingered near the doorway. Clara caught his gaze, reading the conflict etched into his face. "It's okay to let go of the past," she said gently. "You don't have to carry it alone." He gave a small, hesitant smile. "Maybe that's what I'm learning." Meanwhile, at the chapel, Ellen Marrow stood beside Father James beneath a stained glass window that spilled a kaleidoscope of colors onto the stone floor. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. Ellen's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke in a quiet voice. "I never wanted to believe my father was capable of what Clara's uncovered," she confessed. "But I see now that holding on to anger only chains me to his mistakes." Father James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Forgiveness is a difficult path, Ellen, but it is also a doorway to peace. Your willingness to walk it honors both your father and yourself." As the day faded to dusk, Clara stood once more outside the town hall, the cool mountain breeze carrying away the echoes of the day's revelations. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but for the first time since her arrival, she felt a fragile hope take root. Trust, once fractured, could begin to mend not overnight, but with steady, deliberate steps. The hollow promise that had bound this town in silence was no longer impenetrable. In its place, a new covenant was forming, one of truth, accountability, and the courage to face the past together. Clara knew the journey was far from over, but as she watched the fading light paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold, she allowed herself to believe that even the deepest wounds could heal. And just as the stars began to pierce the twilight sky, a subtle shift stirred in the shadows, reminders that while trust was being rebuilt, vigilance was still required. The mountain town stood at a delicate threshold, and Clara was ready to walk it, whatever lay beyond. The story was far from finished. The promise of a new beginning beckoned, but the echoes of the past whispered still, waiting to be heard. Clara Hayes stood at the entrance, her breath visible in the crisp air, clutching a stack of papers tightly against her chest. Today was the first time in many months that the town's residents would gather, not in whispered suspicion or behind closed doors, but openly in the hall where decisions and promises had once been made in shadow. Inside, the aged wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of hesitant townsfolk. The smell of pine mingled with dust and the faint scent of coffee from a small table near the back. Faces, some familiar, others marked by time and unspoken stories, turned toward Clara as she stepped to the front. Her heart pounded with a mixture of nerves and determination. She had come to this town as an outsider, a detective chasing the elusive trail of a vanished mayor and a hollow promise. But now she stood before a community perched on the edge of transformation. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice steady despite the flutter of apprehension. "I know the past few months have been difficult for everyone. The disappearance of Mayor Marrow has shaken this town to its core, but it has also opened a door for change, for honesty, accountability, and healing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Maggie Thornton sat near the back, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes sharp and reflective. She had been a reluctant ally, wary of what truths might surface, but understanding the necessity of this moment. Deputy Sam Collins stood near the side, his usual stoic demeanor softened by the tentative hope that Clara's words inspired. The weight of his divided loyalties had been a silent burden, but here, in this room, the possibility of unity seemed to flicker. Clara continued, "The town's past is complex. The agreements made decades ago, the secrets kept in silence, they have shaped who we are, but we cannot move forward without confronting them. Today, I ask for your voices, your stories, your willingness to face what has been hidden." A hush settled, thick with the gravity of her words. Slowly, hands began to raise, some tentative, others firm. A young man near the front spoke of his desire to see the truth laid bare, while an elder woman voiced fears of old wounds reopening. Throughout, Clara listened, her notes meticulous, but her heart open. After the formal discussion, as the crowd began to disperse, Elias Marrow approached Clara. Her face was shadowed with the same guarded pain Clara had seen before, but softened now by a thread of possibility. "You've done more than I expected," Ellen said quietly. "Maybe there is a way forward, after all." Clara nodded, feeling the fragile hope in her reply. "It won't be easy, but it's a start." Outside, Father James stood beneath the towering pines, watching the town with a gentle smile. In his hands, a well-worn Bible, its pages marked by years of counsel and prayer. He whispered a quiet blessing over the mountain air, a prayer for healing, for courage, for a new dawn. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the rugged peaks, the mountain town breathed in a tentative peace. Broken oaths still lingered in the shadows, but the promise of redemption, of rebuilding trust and community, flickered brighter than ever before. Clara lingered at the doorway, the weight of the investigation still heavy but tempered by the strength of this moment. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and the ghosts of the past. Yet, for the first time since her arrival, she dared to believe in the possibility of change, a new dawn rising over the hollow promise. The sheriff's station was quiet now, the bustle of the investigation finally giving way to a tense calm. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the mayor's journal, the inked words swirling with the weight of promises, betrayals, and a legacy that had bound the mountain town in silence for decades. She exhaled slowly, the air thick with the scent of old paper and damp wood, and let herself sink into the gravity of all she had uncovered. In the weeks since Elias Marrow's disappearance, Clara's journey had peeled back layer after layer of the town's tightly woven fabric. Each revelation had chipped away at the facade of unity, exposing the fractures beneath broken oaths whispered in shadowed corners. Fractured loyalties tangled in fear and guilt, and a community struggling beneath the crushing weight of its own secrets. Clara had walked that precarious line between justice and vengeance, truth and forgiveness, and now, at this quiet hour, she grappled with the cost. The mayor's journal lay open on the desk, his words both a confession and a challenge. Marrow had been a man of contradictions, protector and manipulator, a leader who had cloaked his control in benevolence. Clara understood now that the hollow promise was never simply a pact. It was a mechanism of fear, a chain that bound the town's fate to a fragile, uneasy peace. To expose it was to threaten everything: trust, safety, and the very identity of the mountain community. Yet, despite the darkness, Clara sensed the first flickers of something new, a cautious hope glimmering through the cracks. The townspeople, though wary and wounded, had begun the slow, painful work of reckoning. At the inn, Maggie Thornton had shared a rare moment of candor, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it, speaking of the tentative steps toward healing. Even Deputy Sam Collins, whose loyalties had been torn and tested, seemed to grasp the necessity of change. Seeking perspective, Clara made her way to the town's chapel the following morning. The stained glass windows cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the worn wooden pews, bathing the quiet sanctuary in a muted glow. Father James greeted her with a nod. His calm presence abomed her frayed nerves. "The burden you carry is heavier than most," he said gently, leading her to a pew. "But sometimes truth can set us free, not by erasing the past, but by allowing us to face it with open hearts." Clara absorbed the words, the weight of spiritual solace mingling with the lingering ache of loss. She thought of the mayor's daughter, Elias Marrow, whose return had stirred turbulent emotions and challenged every assumption Clara held. Ellen's pain mirrored the town's, a fractured legacy demanding acknowledgement. As she left the chapel, the crisp mountain air filled her lungs, clearing the fog that had settled in her mind. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. The town stood at a fragile crossroads, its future uncertain but not without hope. Later that day, in the warmth of the inn's common room, Clara and Maggie sat near the crackling fireplace. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, a fragile warmth blossomed between them. They spoke quietly of forgiveness, of the courage it took to face uncomfortable truths, and of the possibility that even broken promises could be mended in time. Night fell, and Clara found herself drawn to the mountain trail winding beyond the town. The mist swirled thick and cold, cloaking the tall pines in ghostly veils. Each step was deliberate, a silent vow echoing in the stillness. She was no longer the uncertain rookie who had arrived weeks ago. She was a seeker of justice, tempered by understanding, aware that truth was rarely black and white, and that the cost of uncovering it was often deeply personal. As dawn broke, the mist began to lift, revealing the rugged peaks bathed in pale light. Clara paused, eyes fixed on the horizon. The investigation was over, but the story of the hollow promise and the lives it touched, was far from finished. She would carry its lessons with her, etched into the fabric of her being. Her resolve was clear. Justice was not simply about uncovering secrets, but about embracing the complexity of human frailty and the possibility of redemption. Whatever lay ahead, Clara was ready to face it with all the doubt, determination, and hope that had brought her this far. And as the mountain town stirred awake beneath the rising sun, so too did the fragile promise of a new beginning. The past was never truly behind them, but maybe, just maybe, it could be a foundation for something stronger, if only they dared to build it. Clara took a deep breath, her footsteps steady as she turned back toward the town. The journey was far from over, but her resolve was unshakable. The hollow promise had been broken, and from its ruin, something new could rise. But in the shadows, unseen eyes watched still, and Clara knew the mountain's silence held more secrets yet to be told. And so, the story continued. The dense mist clung to the evergreens, weaving through their branches and softening the rugged contours of the peaks that had held the town in their shadow for so long. The air was crisp, each breath a sharp reminder of the altitude and the distance she was about to put between herself and the place that had consumed her for weeks. She pulled her jacket tighter, eyes lingering on the cluster of buildings nestled in the valley below in the town hall, the scattered homes all still sealed within the lingering web of the hollow promise. The silence was profound, not the peaceful quiet of untouched nature, but a heavy, expectant hush, as if the very mountains held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Clara had learned that in this town, silence was both shield and weapon, a means of protection and a cage. And now, as she prepared to leave, that silence seemed to pulse with all the secrets she had unearthed, the broken oaths, the fractured loyalties, the buried guilt that had seeped into every stone and street. Behind her, the door of the inn creaked open, and Maggie Thornton stepped out into the pale light. Her weathered face held the lines of years spent guarding this community, eyes sharp but softened by the weight of recent revelations. "You're really leaving, then?" Maggie said, her voice low but steady. Clara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "I am. There's nothing left for me here now, except maybe hope." Maggie gave a reluctant nod and gestured toward the inn's porch, where the warm glow of the firelight spilled through the windows. They moved inside, the scent of burning wood and worn leather wrapping around them like an old friend. The room was quiet, but alive with memories, conversations whispered in corners, the hum of lives intertwined over generations. "You've done more than I thought possible," Maggie said, settling into a chair, exposing the hollow promise. "It's like tearing the town's skin off, but maybe it's what we needed." Clara's gaze drifted to the flickering flames, shadows dancing as if to a silent rhythm. It's never simple with places like this. Truth can set you free, but it can also destroy. I've seen that firsthand. The door opened again, and Deputy Sam Collins entered, his uniform worn and dusted with the mountain's grit. His eyes flickered between the two women, guarded but unable to hide the conflict simmering beneath his steady exterior. "You ready to go, Clara?" he asked, voice rough but not unkind. She looked up, noting the strain in his posture, the invisible chains of loyalty pulling him in opposing directions. "Yes, Sam, it's time." He nodded slowly, then hesitated. "This town won't be the same. Neither will you." Clara met his gaze, the weight of unsaid words hanging between them. "No, it won't, but maybe that's not such a bad thing." As the dawn brightened outside, Elias Marrow appeared at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft light. Her sharp eyes held traces of pain and defiance, shadowed by the legacy of a father both revered and reviled. She stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with something fragile. "Thank you, detective, for seeing through the lies." Clara offered a small nod, the complexity of their shared understanding settling in the room. Then Father James, the town's quiet moral compass, joined them briefly, offering a blessing whispered with humility and hope for the days to come. Outside, Clara's footsteps crunched on the gravel as she approached the bus waiting to carry her down the winding mountain road. The engine's rumble stirred the stillness, a mechanical heartbeat against the natural quiet. She glanced back once more, the town shrinking beneath the rising sun, its secrets laid bare but its future still uncertain. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of promises made and broken, of trust betrayed and tentative redemption. Clara settled into her seat by the window, the landscape blurring as the bus began its descent. Her thoughts lingered on the fragile bonds she had witnessed, the moral shadows she had navigated, and the cost of uncovering truth in a place held captive by its past. She did not know what awaited the town beyond the hollow promise, but she was certain of one thing: some secrets never fully fade, and some stories, no matter how deeply buried, continue to echo in the silence. As the bus wound its way down the mountain, Clara closed her eyes briefly, the lessons of the investigation settling deep within her. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she felt, for the first time in weeks, a quiet resolve taking root. The promise of justice was fragile, like the mountain air thin, rarefied and precious, and with that, the journey forward began. Clara Hayes stood silently at the overlook, the crisp morning air cool against her face, mingling with the weight that had settled in her chest over the past weeks. The town was quiet now, but the silence felt fragile, as if the very foundations of this place were still trembling beneath the surface, caught between past shadows and an uncertain future. She pulled her jacket tighter, eyes tracing the familiar contours of the rooftops, the winding streets, the dense clusters of evergreens that framed the settlement like a protective embrace. This was home to so many secrets, each whispered promise and broken oath woven into the very fabric of the mountain town. Elias Marrow's disappearance had unraveled the delicate balance of power and fear, exposing raw edges of betrayal and guilt that no one here could fully escape. Clara's footsteps echoed softly as she turned away from the edge and made her way down toward the heart of town. The inn, the unofficial gathering place, was already stirring with early risers. Inside, the familiar warmth of flickering firelight and rich wood greeted her. But beneath that comfort lingered an undercurrent of tension. Maggie Thornton, the steadfast innkeeper, moved among the tables with quiet determination, her keen eyes scanning the room as voices rose and fell in cautious debate. The elders sat clustered in one corner, their faces lined with years of burden and unspoken regrets, while younger town members sat apart, their expressions taut with frustration and hope. The mayor's hollow promise had fractured generations, leaving a chasm between past loyalty and a desire for change. The conversation was careful, measured, but the unease was palpable. Words like trust, accountability, and reconciliation floated tentatively through the air, as if testing the ground beneath them. Clara took a seat near the back, watching, listening. Her presence was no longer that of an outsider, but a catalyst one who had stirred the still waters of this mountain town's collective conscience. She caught Deputy Sam Collins' eye across the room. His usual stoic demeanor cracked momentarily, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. The deputy's internal battle had mirrored the town's own struggle, torn between protecting the fragile order and confronting uncomfortable truths. Later, Clara found herself drawn to the mayor's old office, now silent and stripped of its commanding presence. Ellen Marrow, sharp-featured and guarded, was already there, standing by the window with her back to the room. The estranged daughter's visit was fraught with layers of resentment and reluctant acceptance. She traced her fingers across the worn wooden desk, her thoughts a tangle of anger, sorrow, and the heavy legacy left behind. "It's strange," Ellen said quietly, not turning round. "How a place can feel so full of memories, and yet so empty at the same time." Clara nodded, understanding more than words could express. Sometimes, the hardest part is knowing what to hold onto and what to let go. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Father James entered, his gentle presence a balm amid the storm of emotions. Later that evening, the three shared a rare moment in the chapel, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. They spoke of justice, forgiveness, and the moral complexities that had entangled them all. "Redemption isn't a straight path," Father James mused, voice low and steady. "It's a winding road, marked by doubt and hope in equal measure." Clara met his gaze, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. The journey they had all embarked upon was far from over. The town's scars ran deep, but beneath them lay a stubborn ember of resilience. As dawn gave way to morning, Clara packed her belongings, her mind a swirl of memories and possibilities. Leaving the mountain town was bittersweet. She carried with her the weight of its broken promises, the faces of those who had trusted her, and the lessons etched into her very soul. At the threshold of departure, Maggie approached quietly, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Thank you for not letting us hide forever." Clara returned the smile, a flicker of resolve shining in her eyes. "This isn't the end, it's just the beginning." The road ahead was uncertain, both for Clara and the town she was leaving behind. But in that fragile crossroads lay the possibility of healing, renewal, and the courage to face whatever shadows remained. And as she stepped into the waiting light, Clara knew that some promises, no matter how hollow, could spark a transformation if met with truth, courage, and unwavering hope. The mountain peaks stood silent sentinels, watching over a town poised on the edge of change, their secrets whispering in the wind like a fragile vow that might yet be kept.